sustainable. Fossil fuel intensive industrial agriculture negatively impacts climate, land use, freshwater resources, and biodiversity. Most fisheries are fully exploited or overexploited. Yet it's estimated that a quarter of the world's population is malnourished, with 2 billion people consuming diets deficient in micronutrients and over 800 million people unable to secure enough calories to meet their minimum daily energy requirements. By 2050, the world's population is projected to approach 9.5 billion people. To secure an adequate food supply during the second half of the 21st century, society must intensify the output of its food production system while simultaneously reducing its detrimental impacts on the climate system and the global environment. The goals of the marine circular bioeconomy are first, to intensify the output of society's food production system through innovative advances in marine aquaculture, and second, to reduce the detrimental impacts of industrial agriculture on the global environment. The primary environmental sustainability objectives include first, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, second, reducing freshwater use, third, reducing the arable land footprint, fourth, reducing eutrophication, and fifth, reducing biodiversity loss. The secondary objectives include exploring the role of marine microalgae and macroalgae production in one, the recycling of nutrients in wastewater treatment, and two, the co-production of algae-based bioenergy in construction materials. Today, we'll be hearing from some of the leaders in this new emerging field. First up is Froehlich from UC Santa Barbara. She will be discussing the future of aquaculture and food from the sea. Second is Steve Mayfield from UC San Diego. He will be discussing the future of algal biomaterials. And third, Celina Scott-Buechler from Cornell. She will be discussing the future of algae and achieving food security and environmental sustainability.
Hi, welcome everybody. I'm not sure whether you all got the audio on that, but so I'm welcoming you again. We're going to start the first three talks, and I just wanted to mention to everybody that the question and answers will be at the end of those three talks. So you can send your questions in the chat and I'll keep track of those. And then I'll make sure that we ask your questions during the Q&A afterwards. So please send us your questions that way. So let's get started and we will put up the first video with Halley Froehlich from UC Santa Barbara.
Hi everyone, thrilled to kick off Ocean Vision Session 4, hopefully laying down a nice foundation for thinking about the future of aquaculture and food from the sea. So I think all of us in this room has seen some variation of this figure showing the growing importance of aquaculture in our food system, and even more so if we were to include seaweeds, especially when we compare it to capture fisheries over time. And importantly, aquaculture is quite diverse, right? There's a lot of context dependencies of what form is important, what species, where. FAO has identified about 600 species or groups being cultivated for production purposes, both food and otherwise. The majority of that is still freshwater aquaculture, 40% being marine. Both of them are growing about the same rate, except when you kind of dive into certain taxonomic groups or species. Something like seaweeds, for instance, is growing fastest. And importantly, very skewed production, unlike our other parts of the food system, which really, again, highlights something like freshwater aquaculture being really important in some regions, but also, I would argue, highlighting the potential of other forms like those in the marine sector. And so today I'm going to kind of highlight 3 themes of my research, hopefully orienting us in this kind of future basis that we're going to be in for the next few hours. First, I'm going to talk about that potential, again, really heavily focused on marine production. I want to emphasize this is not de-emphasizing the importance of other parts of the sector or other dimensions that aquaculture can fill. This is simply one aspect of a very complex but exciting form and field. So we're going to talk about the potentials in the seas. We're then going to talk about the inherent limitations and connections, specifically with wild fisheries, or at least considering those, and then of course ending in talking about climate change, the elephant in the room when it comes to thinking about our food systems, both contributing and being impacted by. But let's start here. So a lot of research is coming out showing that there's lots of potential, in particular one that I was a part of, led by Rebecca Gentry, focused on just getting a sense of physical suitability. So being fairly conservative and where may be the best places given the species that we know can be grown, best being based on those kind of more physical parameters of growth for species. Red showing the kind of hotspots there, really good for species in the green as well. And that's not to say you can't grow it in the white areas. We were just quite conservative and use this as a basis to explore those dimensions. But of course, there are inherent limitations that were not accounted for in the study, whether that be time, cost, accommodating and including considerations for fisheries and reform therein, technology, and changes in demand. And so that's what a study that Chris Costello led, that I also had the pleasure to be a part of, that was recently published in Nature, to look at what that future may behold for marine aquaculture. I should also say that in the study, we do have a business as usual accounting for freshwater production in it as well. So what you're looking at here, and you're going to see a couple of these donut plots repeated, is the current composition percentage of marine wild fisheries, finfish, and bivalve mariculture for the total amount of edible weight. So that image I showed you in the beginning, that's total production. Now this is obviously constrained because we're now accounting for kind of edible proportions for these various species and groups. And not surprisingly, what we all know is that wild capture fisheries in the marine environment, exceedingly important and will continue to be so into the future. But what we can explore now is how much or how little aquaculture and wild fisheries can improve to meet growing demand. So if we were to predict out the 2050s, kind of business as usual into the future of that demand, we see an increase to about 80 metric tons and that composition of marine aquaculture expanding, matching, or at least trying to keep up with that demand. I should also say within this study, one of the assumptions we have is that fisheries reform happens for all fisheries. That would bump up the production about 16%. Right? Not bad, but again, not enough to fill in that gap and requiring that something like marine aquaculture fill that need. And in fact, we can explore even further of how much could it expand given the constraints that I mentioned of something like the demand that would be there, technology, as well as policy that allows and enables things like expansion of bivalve aquaculture. And so when we do that, we see even greater expansion of these systems, in particular, the finfish sector. And the kind of take home here is that farming a very small proportion of the ocean, which we see in other studies as well, could feasibly produce a large amount. In this case, given these kind of more real world constraints, a 2- to 4-fold increase compared to something like that 16% increase for fisheries reform. But again, working in unison, accounting for multiple forms, it really does highlight that aquaculture does have a pretty high potential when we're focused on the marine environment. And noticeably absent from the study, and a lot of studies arguably looking at these kind of multi-dimension futurescapes, is seaweeds. There's lots of physically suitable seaweed area too. This was a paper that I did that was published in 2019 exploring this, but I'm not going to go into detail because a lot of smart people are going to dive into these aspects, but I did want to note that there are aspects that are missing still from these larger evaluations, but really important as we'll talk about today. So potential is high, especially for marine aquaculture, and tech and policy end up being a really key feature of either enabling or limiting. And in particular, interactions with fisheries, accounting for that ends up being a critical one and was highlighted actually part of that study. What was found and is consistent with other studies is that fed aquaculture of things like finfish and crustaceans are going to be inherently limited by feed, and in particular its interaction with forage fish species that are rendered for meal and oil, either through that kind of compound feed chain, something that looks like this, which is the majority of fed species, or through that kind of more direct farm level feed. But importantly, what we see is that changes are occurring that are alleviating or allowing this transition and expansion of aquaculture, given inherent limitations to forage fish, which I should say account for about 1/3 of all landings globally. So they're really important to the general food sector and certainly aquaculture. But we see trends changing over time, everything from the lessening use in the agricultural sector that opens up that feed ingredient for aquaculture, which is what we see over time since the 1960s to now, where aquaculture is now the dominant user group. So it's not a new form of reduction. This has been around for a while. We also see this kind of change happening within the aquaculture sector of marine ingredients becoming fewer and fewer, being replaced by alternative feed ingredients, largely from the terrestrial sector of soy and other plant-based ingredients because they are cheap, and largely driven by the agricultural sector, right? So again, we see ingredients, marine ingredients shown there in blue, in this case from 1990 to 2016. This is for Atlantic salmon and Norwegian salmon, one of the most highly valued and studied species around this, but it's not the only one. We see this pattern play out in a suite of species, commercially produced species, both freshwater and marine. And across the board, across all these studies, what we find is that more rapid adoption of alternative feeds will help not only decouple and release that potential pressure alongside policy, which I have to emphasize here, just reducing these alternative or introducing alternative feeds does not necessarily beget savings for forage fish, but coupled with alternative feeds and policy, you get a good combination here. And technology alternatives like macroalgae and microalgae that you'll be hearing a lot about are definitely key to that decoupling and ability for aquaculture to grow arguably more sustainably. But of course, I said interactions, and this is only one interaction as viewed in this very simplified conceptual model of our capture fisheries and ecosystems, our wild target populations interacting and feeding back into fed species and unfed species in aquaculture. Whether that is more potential neutral interactions or feedbacks that can happen, negative ones certainly, as well as potential positive ones. All of these things end up becoming increasingly important, especially for accounting, as aquaculture potentially becomes even more dominant in spaces like the marine environment. However, mostly management is done in silos. They are not done together. So feed alternatives and policy promote decoupling, and there isn't just one type of interaction. There's magnitude or multitude of interactions, really kind of emphasizing, and what I'm going to highlight at the end of this is thinking about, well, how do we manage for that? How do we integrate something like this into the future between these two systems? All right, and now let's conclude on climate change. What beholds aquaculture under climate change? Well, one thing is trying to build out the evidence for what's happening now and what's happening in the future. There's not as much evidence as there is in fisheries and agriculture, and some of my work is focused on trying to expand that understanding. One in particular is attribution of climate change impacts now. What are we seeing now? Do we have evidence of that? And we do. So here's some kind kind of high level results of some of the impacts being linked to climate change already associated with aquaculture. And it's also, and importantly about the future, if we know things are already happening now, it's going to be even more pressing to then, as we plan and potentially expand marine aquaculture, understand what's to come, right? Set the basis now. What are the mitigating and adaptive strategies already? How much do we need to do into the future, species-wise, locations, policy, etc. So my colleagues and I did some work to do one of the most comprehensive evaluations for stab at can we even pick up a signal in comparison to something like fisheries impacts. And so we used a growth model similar to that of the one I described, or we used to make the map that I showed at the beginning. Created a growth performance index for about 200 species, linked that up with thermal tolerance limits, ocean acidification, chlorophyll limits as well, specifically for the bivalves, and employed an ensemble model approach across 27 sea surface temperature models, 24 chlorophyll models, and an aragonite saturation model using RCP 8.5 2100 to again see if we could even pick up a signal here, and using ensemble and this kind of more extreme condition would allow us to do that. And so we made a whole bunch of maps, did a lot of modeling for every single country, and got something like this. This is for finfish, cumulative change over time for production potential. Blues are declines, warmer colors are increases, and what you'll notice is a lot of heterogeneity. But if we look and kind of aggregate that information, we can calculate the probability of impact, which ends up being really important for aquaculture because we don't have a global map of where aquaculture actually is in the waters. So it makes it hard to kind of really have high levels of precision on what's going to happen and accuracy. So instead, we can look at probability of potential declines. And so that was what we did. Each individual dot is a country or territory for each individual time step. And what we find is that by mid-century, without any sort of grand interventions, we do see a potential for increased declines in any given region. And importantly, one of the major conclusions was that we see a greater probability of declines for bivalves, and that's largely due to the triple threat of changes in their food source, chlorophyll changes, the temperature changes, as well as, of course, ocean acidification. So climate change is already impacting aquaculture, and impacts are more certain, not surprisingly, without interventions. And this is especially true for bivalves, which is really interesting because that's one of the low impact food sources that is being promoted as a really important part of marine aquaculture expansion, but they may be more sensitive and at risk. So a bit of a tension there for future planning. And as I mentioned, all of these things are interacting and are going to be really hard to account for moving forward, but is something that we really need. And one way to move forward in this direction that could help address both interactions, planning, and that of climate change is thinking about integrating these management systems and coordination. So for instance, employing an ecosystem-based approach allows to have stakeholders and co-managers at the table, making plans, setting sustainability measures, and ideally holistic decision support systems that feed back into adaptive strategies that have shown not only to accommodate or help interactions across sectors, but also address impacts of climate change. So you get a bit of two birds, one stone situation here. So with that, I'll conclude that, and just thanks to all my amazing collaborators and funding agencies. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Stephen Mayfield, Professor of Biology at UC San Diego and the Director of the California Center for Algae Biotechnology. And today we're going to talk about the future of algae for biomaterials. All right, so what do we mean by biomaterials? They could be a lot of things. They could be protein, they could be carbohydrates, they could be lipids for fuels, but in this case, we're going to talk about using algae biomass to make renewable polymers. Why polymers? Well, because we've covered our planet in plastic trash. There are 17 trillion pounds of trash on this planet. That is 2,600 pounds for every man, woman, and child alive today. The central picture is a picture I took on vacation when I was in the Maldives and the Indian Ocean, and stopped by a little uninhabited island one day just to have lunch, and it was covered in dead flip-flops and water bottles. The picture in the upper left-hand corner is actually a picture taken by a group down in Australia that went to an island about 1,000 miles off the west coast of Australia to see what plastic trash looked like in that part of the ocean. And again, covered 17 inches deep on average, with thousands of toothbrushes, razors, flip-flops, water bottles, you name it. 18 billion pounds of plastic trash flow into the ocean every year. And we just thought this has to change. And as I'll show you, algae has the potential to do something about that. So what's the basic premise? Pretty simple. Plastic comes from petroleum. Petroleum comes from algae. Let's make plastic from algae. So the idea is that algae can sequester CO2 in photosynthesis and turn that into oils. Now, those oils accumulated over hundreds of millions of years, and that became petroleum, and we use petroleum to make plastic. So let's just do this in real time. Let's take that oil and turn it into polymers. And then if we do that right, let's see if we can get those polymers to degrade at the end of their life and go back into CO2. So that would be the carbon cycle. But of course, the trick is, can we actually do that? So why would we use algae as a platform for this? I think there are four things that I think about. One is that you have to be able to reach world scale if you want to address a world problem like plastic pollution. And algae clearly have the ability to do that. They're in every ocean, every river, every lake today. They also need to be efficient. You can't have an organism that produces, 10 pounds per acre when we need tons per acre production. And just to give you what some of those numbers are, there's about 800 billion pounds of plastic produced every year in the world. There's also about 2 trillion pounds of protein. The kind of interesting thing about algae and why we really think of these things as sustainable is if we can grow these things using non-potable water and non-arable land, we have an ability to make lipids, which we can convert into polymers. And that's about 1/3 of the biomass. And then the other 2/3 is protein and carbohydrate that we can use for animal or even human feed. And then the last thing that's really kind of nice about algae is that they're programmable, meaning we completely understand their genomes, we have them sequenced, and we can do pretty sophisticated metabolic engineering of them now. So they make the product that we want them to make. And I should simply point out that there are no industrial organisms that we use today, not corn, not rice, not pigs, not chickens, that have not been extensively genetically engineered over the last hundreds or even thousands of years. Well, okay, if we're going to take lipids from algae and we're going to turn them into plastics, we should probably start with a plastic that is naturally biodegradable. And believe it or not, there are some of those. Not the big ones, right? Not ethyl vinyl acetate, not polystyrene, not low density or high density polypropylene or polyethylene. None of these are biodegradable. Some of them are recyclable. For example, I'm sure all of us know that water bottles, polyethylene terephthalate, that can be recycled. That recycling is done by melting and recasting them. Every time you melt them, you degrade a little bit of the quality of the plastic. So we're capped at about 20% recycled content in most high quality polymers. But there are a couple that are naturally biodegradable, and those are the polyesters. And specifically, the one we're going to talk about today are polyester polyurethanes. So those are both biodegradable, as we'll show you, and also recyclable. But recyclable not by melting and recasting, because they're a thermoset, not a thermoplastic polymer. That means they don't melt, they burn at high temperature. But we can actually depolymerize them and recycle them from a molecular sense. And we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so what are polyester polyurethanes? First of all, I should say that they are in everything. They're in the seat cushion that you're sitting on right now. They're in all of your shoe soles, their tires, their insulation in houses, a very abundant polymer. They're organic polymers, and they all contain a urethane group, right? Polyurethanes always contain a urethane group, and then they can either contain a polyester backbone or a polyether backbone. The polyether backbones are not very biodegradable. The polyester backbones can be biodegraded. How do you make a polyurethane? It's a reaction between an isocyanate, it's that group right there, and an alcohol. So you need at least 2 alcohols and 2 isocyanate groups. So they're diisocyanates and diol or a polyol. And then those 2 link together to form a urethane bond. The backbone is an ester bond. So that's how you get a polyester polyol. Okay. So we can assemble the backbone, the polyester polyol portion, that's using naturally occurring diacids and diols. There's a few diols that we've managed to either engineer cells to make or that accumulate naturally. None of them accumulate naturally very high levels, but we can make we can make 1,4-propane diol, we can make 1,4-butane diol, or 1,6-hexane diol. So we can make these 3 dialcohols. There are a variety of diacids, lots of them, some of them quite famous: succinic acid, oxalic acid, adipic acid, subbasic acid. These are all naturally occurring diacids, and we can combine these together to make the polyol backbone of it. So if you combine these together in such a way that you end up with a linear polyol with alcohols on either end, then when you mix those with a diisocyanate, you tend to get flexible foams. If you have a polyol that has multiple or branched alcohols and mix those with an isocyanate, you tend to get rigid foams. And so the first foam that we actually made were rigid foams. We made surfboards. They turn out to only be about 400,000 of those are made every year, so maybe 400,000 kilograms. But if you get into soft foams, like I said, that is everything. That's furniture, that's bedding, that's the underlayment of your carpet, that's shoes. These are billions of kilograms. So we elected to go after the soft polyurethanes as a product that more profoundly impacts the environment. So the fact that we could make a polyol from algae did not mean that we could make a foam, at least not that we could make a foam that met commercial specification. We actually had to go back and make certain that they met commercial specification. That's called formulation. That's all the cooking part of it. That's, we add a little bit of surfactant, we add a little bit of catalyst, a blowing agent, cross-linking hardeners. It took quite some time. It took about 2 years before we could take our algae polyols and actually formulate those to meet specification for a commercial product. Our first product was a flip-flop. We've now made shoes, we've made backpack foams, we've made a number of soft foams. As I said, polyester polyols and urethane bonds are naturally biodegradable. Both the polyester and the urethane bond are degradable by enzymes. So if you do everything right, they should have been biodegradable at the end. We actually had, also while we were doing the formulation, we were testing these. There are some things you can do that block biodegradation, but if you do it right, you can end up with a foam that meets specification here for the shoe, for the flip-flop footbed, that degrades quite rapidly. Actually, it degraded in about 16 weeks in soil and about 24 weeks in compost. We now actually have better compost. We can degrade the compost ones actually faster than that. So this is home compost, not industrial composting. Importantly, while we were doing that, we were doing both a physical analysis of the breakdown of the foam. We were identifying the breakdown products to make sure that we weren't producing toxins. We weren't predicted to. We know where the bonds are. We know what comes out of them when we break them. Sure enough, no toxins. But importantly, we identified the microorganisms in the enzymes. And I'll show you why we did that. We did that because what is biodegradation? Biodegradation is not that a microorganism comes along and eats the polymer, like takes bites out of it the way you do a hamburger. The way microorganisms degrade any material, it doesn't matter if you're talking about protein, if you're talking about carbohydrate, if you're talking about polyurethanes. What they do is they secrete enzyme lipases, esterases, and urethaneases, and those come and clip the bonds. And so what happens is you take a polymer and you depolymerize that back into the monomers, and then the organisms eat the monomers. So in this case, the background, the diacid, it could have been adipic acid, you know, organism breaks it down and then eats the adipic acid. Well, we looked at this and said, well, wait, why don't we just take the enzymes and rather than biodegrade these things, let's depolymerize them and see if we can't recapture the monomers. So we did that, and this is just a breakdown of a very simple foam, which simply had MDI methylene diisocyanate, 2 alcohols, 2 diols, and 1 diacid. And sure enough, we could degrade those right back from the starting foam. So what does that give us an opportunity to do? We now have foams that meet commercial specification. If these things happen to get lost, like you're out sailing and you lose your shoes and they end up in the ocean, they will naturally degrade. In the ocean, it takes about a year. Actually, things degrade slower in the ocean than they do in compost pile or soil, because oceans don't have the phosphate and the nitrogen and the rest of the stuff they need. So they're slow to degrade, but they do degrade in about a year instead of thousands of years, which the normal plastics do. So we have an opportunity to do that. We can have biodegradable polymers if we want. And you can, in fact, take these shoes or flip-flops, throw them in your compost pile in your backyard, and they will be mulch in less than 6 months. But a much more efficient way to do this is we simply take the products back in. So you wear your pair of shoes for a couple of years, you finally worn them out, you send them back to us, we bring them in, we grind them up, we depolymerize those polyurethanes with enzymes. We recapture the starting diols, diacids, and then we use those to resynthesize new monomers and use those monomers to make new products. If we do this, what we say is we have a conservation of chemical energy. So we're not putting this all the way back to CO2 and then having to use the photosynthetic energy to recapture it. The enzymatic release of these requires very little energy. You know how efficient enzymes are. And that means we can very efficiently recapture these and apparently infinitely recycle them, because every time we go through a depolymerization and a recapture, that gives us an opportunity to clean up, to throw out the parts of the monomers that have been degraded. One really important aspect of this is both the polyol synthesis and flip-flop production required really limited infrastructure. This is actually pictured from our lab where we make our own flip-flops. You simply mix the isocyanate and the polyols together, you pour them into a mold, and in about 5 to 6 minutes, you pop the parts out of that mold. All you need is a footbed, an outsole, cotton strap. You glue all those things together and you have a shoe ready to go. So this technology can easily be deployed worldwide. And it's important that we do that because there are presently 24 billion, with a B, pairs of shoes made every year on this planet. And obviously the vast majority of those end up in either landfills or, if we're really unlucky, in the natural environment. So I think we have a great opportunity this. Obviously the challenge is going to be how fast can we scale it up? Cost, right now the cost is not too bad, but we have to work on getting that down. So thank you for your time. I will leave it at that and entertain questions at the end of this.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending our session. My name is Celina Scott-Buechler, and I'm the co-chair of Ocean Vision's Marine Circular Bioeconomy Task Force. Much of what I'll be presenting today is a product of my master's research at Cornell University, working with Chuck Greene, who is the chair of this task force. My research comprises 3 main questions, which will provide the roadmap for my talk today. First, what environmental footprints can we expect to have by mid-century, assuming current production methods persist? Second, what is the gap between this eventuality for 2050 and international goals set for planetary stability, especially the Paris Agreement? And third, how might microalgae help to fill this gap? So a little bit of background first. Much of the focus of global sustainability targets has been on power generation and transportation. Food systems present special challenges and have received less policy attention on the global stage. However, it is estimated that food production represents 38% of ice-free land. Agriculture in total, about 43% of ice-free land, and 87% of this is for food, thus 38% for food production. And meeting 2050 food demand is expected to require between 1.5 and 7.3 square kilometers of agricultural expansion, compared with the current 11 million square kilometers of cropland that we have today, which already poses threats to biodiversity and climate stability. Food systems are also estimated to use 90 to 95% of scarcity-weighted fresh water across the world and produce 25 to 42% of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's estimated that approximately 71% of these emissions come from land use and land change. And so land is a critical factor when thinking about climate and food systems. But also conversely, environmental change poses risks to food systems. Shifting ecoregions, natural disasters with increased frequency and severity, and changing soil conditions have all raised alarms among scientists and policymakers. At their extreme, disruptions to global food systems can lead to severe human instability, migration, and even violent conflict. Protein is a critical macronutrient for human health and is also responsible for a large share of food's environmental impacts. Sustainably meeting the protein needs of a growing global population is a social as well as environmental imperative. And that is what my research focuses on. Here, the first step to understanding these intersecting challenges is to identify how protein needs will vary at country and region levels. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization projects food supply through 2050, from which we isolated major protein sources. This map will be 2050 at the country level. The color gradient shows the increase or decrease of total annual protein need in metric tons for the year 2050 under the business as usual scenario, which I'll talk a bit more about later in this talk. In total, the world will need approximately 51 trillion additional tons of protein between now and 2050. What impact would this addition of protein have on global climate goals? Well, assuming current production practices persist, protein-based emissions could exceed 1/5 of the remaining carbon budget for the Paris Accords target of 1.5 degrees Celsius, and could even approach 1/4 of this total. As I alluded to earlier, our team relies on the FAO's scenarios for changes in consumptions, whereby business as usual represents moderate economic growth and is an extension of the IPCC's SSP2 middle of the road scenario. Stratified societies represents a world in which power and resources are further consolidated among wealthy countries, leading to increased poverty and environmental degradation. This extends IPCC's SSP4, a road divided scenario. And towards sustainability represents active global efforts towards sustainable development goals, and is SSP1, the green road scenario. What if we could produce the world's protein with a fraction of land, freshwater, and greenhouse gas emissions under any of these scenarios, regardless of political and social outcomes, though recognizing that those are preconditions for changing food systems? Marine microalgae are gaining traction to help meet these needs. The focus of my work have been autotrophic marine microalgae, which are exceptionally efficient photosynthesizers, converting solar energy to biomass in a matter of days to weeks, rather than the months or even years required by terrestrial crops and animal-sourced foods. Relative to terrestrial crops, marine microalgae have higher productivity on the order of 1 to 2 orders of magnitude than terrestrial crops, can use otherwise non-productive, non-arable land, do not compete with traditional agriculture for land or fresh water, and do not lead to fertilizer runoff, and downstream eutrophication, as these are closed circular bioeconomies. Marine microalgae are, most importantly to my work, rich in protein and critical micronutrients. And as a result, they have been part of the human diet for thousands of years and explored for commercialization since about the 1960s. 11 countries currently produce microalgae, China representing 99.5% of reported production. So certainly they have a corner on the market. And the nutritional benefits of marine microalgae include up to 70% protein content, which is higher than meat, poultry, and dairy by dry weight. And they contain complete essential amino acid profiles, which are hard to come by in plant-based proteins and often come from seafood. These critical micronutrients are important for brain development, for fetal development, and throughout lifetimes. Microalgae could be turned into vegan meats, but probably the most effective way of increasing protein consumption is through diverse inclusion in gastrocultural contexts, so as food additives. And we're seeing just that. Although the vast majority of production is currently in Southeast Asia and still represents a small minority of protein intake, other culinary traditions are beginning to incorporate marine microalgae. Initially, microalgae's blue-green color and fishy taste posed significant barriers to breaking into Western markets, but food processing methods have advanced to be able to neutralize both the color and the taste, as shown in these photos. The powders on the spoons are all from microalgae, but processed in different ways, I think slightly different strains. Microalgae have already successfully been incorporated into biscuits, breads, cookies, snacks, yogurts, vegetarian food gels, pastas, the list goes on. And use in various products has outpaced many other niche food ingredients in recent decades, indicating a market willingness for microalgae inclusion. There are a number of ways of cultivating microalgae. What I'm referring to specifically is efficient production method in terms of energy and end product quality, which combines photobioreactors, which are closed systems that allow microalgae to grow uncontaminated in their initial stages. And then the marine microalgae are transferred out into these coastal raceway ponds, which are shown here. These are open systems to which the microalgae are transferred and complete their growth and require a fraction of the energy, and again are all salt water. So where can microalgae be grown? Using GIS methods, we're able to take the values reported in Moody et al. 2014 and interpolate geospatially to create a global map of expected biomass yields. With recent attention paid to commercial scale microalgae cultivation methods have been improved upon since 2014, and a US Department of Energy figure suggests a 69% yield improvement, which we then use as an upper bound as compared with the values reported here. The sites that emerge in the 90th percentile of suitable ice-free land are those highlighted here. When we take into account the basic geophysical viability factors for microalgae farming in terrestrial raceway ponds, which are land slopes, you need to have flat land to host these large ponds, proximity to seawater, and annual solar radiation. If you recall in the previous slide, the areas that were in warmer colors indicating higher biomass yields were generally located around the tropics. Heavily populated areas and protected areas are excluded from consideration so that each of these sites could potentially be used for microalgae production. And the geospatial resolution is 100 hectares, which is essentially the scale of one facility according to a number of life cycle assessment and techno-economic analysis reviews. And then if we optimize for the highest biomass yields and lowest cost, at least in terms of geophysical viability, we are able to meet 100% of the world's projected protein needs for 2050 using the small amount of land that is indicated here. provide a bit of context, what's shown here are current cultivated lands for agriculture and for grazing. So grazing here is in green and croplands in blue. These are conservative representations, only showing lands that are intensively grazed or grown, so 75% or greater. Significantly more land than this is used for these purposes, but at lower intensities. And this just provides kind of an indication of how little land would be required to meet 100% of the world's protein needs. Recognizing that all protein coming from microalgae is probably unrealistic, but at least to sort of understand what the effects could be on global food systems and to move toward increased incorporation of microalgae into the human diet. So what effects could this integration have by 2050? Well, again, comparing 100% of protein needs by 2050, if they were met by beef, soy, or microalgae. And this gives you the kind of the basic food impacts in terms of land, in hectares, stress-weighted water in liters, and CO2 equivalents in gigatons. The visual here to me is striking, but for those of you who think in numerical terms, compared with soy, microalgae would require half the amount of land, 1/500th the amount of fresh water, while producing 1/4,000 the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent in greenhouse gas emissions. Compared with beef, these differences are even starker. Microalgae would require 1/130th of the amount of land, 1/7000th the amount of fresh water, while producing 1/80,000 the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent. And again, this is purely for illustrative purposes. We're not suggesting that all protein by 2050 come from microalgae, but just to show the differential impacts and to think about the next stage of our modeling efforts, which is to see how much microalgae and where in the map of protein gap need that I showed earlier in this presentation, microalgae could make a real impact. So with that, thank you for listening, and I encourage your questions in the QA session.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. So we are now entering the question and answer session. We didn't get a lot of questions. You could potentially add some more if you wish, but let me start off with the few that we have. So the first questions I'll have for Halley. Recently, there was a provocative paper by Belton et al., which really suggested that the future of aquaculture was in freshwater finfish, and that marine finfish really couldn't contribute a lot, and even if there's an expansion in shellfish. I was just curious what your take is on that, and yeah.
Great. Thanks, Chuck. Yeah, so I would say no one size fits all, right? So Belton and others are located, and most of the work that they do and study is in Southeast Asia, where freshwater aquaculture is the predominant form. But that being said, there are massive shifts happening, and the baselines are very different depending on where you are. So if we go to a place like the United States, which is where I focus most of my efforts, marine aquaculture and freshwater aquaculture are neck and neck, and marine aquaculture is actually growing a little faster, right? So the relevance of this and where it matters depends on where you are in the world, and the implications of the United States being one of the largest consumers. It is the largest importer of seafood in the world, imports the vast majority of marine organisms as their kind of primary food source. So reconciling what those dynamics are, recognition of global trade, really puts into perspective what marine aquaculture could provide. I should also say, I think Celina's work really highlights the potential really well for marine aquaculture as well, of kind of the relevance of land and sea in those relative percentages. And then I'll just conclude on recognizing the limitations of freshwater aquaculture will be really important, as well as its potential. So thinking about what climate change will do relative to freshwater aquaculture in terms of the floods we're already seeing devastating the brackish and freshwater systems that tend to be along the coastlines of those regions, and drought. Being from California, freshwater aquaculture would be really, really hard to do as a viable option, but that's not to say it's not important at other locations.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important in looking at the Belt and all arguments is that the focus has been traditionally on finfish and shellfish, and there's really very little discussion about marine algae, both macroalgae and microalgae, as well as marine plants. And when you sort of look at those opportunities, it changes the dynamics quite a bit. There was recently a really nice review paper by Naylor and company that one of the points that they made was that marine macroalgae aquaculture production in 2017 was equivalent to all marine aquaculture production 20 years earlier. So I think we're in a really dynamic field. I'm just curious what your take is on that.
Yeah, I think the seaweed story is the unsung hero that gets overlooked, which I tried to capture a little bit in the beginning of my talk. Of most of the assessments that we do aren't focused on the seaweed dimension. And so that type of crop, which we can see in agricultural landscapes, that's a huge role and a huge part of the land-based sector, and we just kind of overlook it. So for instance, of the preliminary study that we're trying to aggregate, what are the impacts of climate change, both on farm seaweed and how far seaweed can mitigate that. The earliest paper I could find in the scientific literature wasn't until 2014. So it's just ripe for investigation and research when it comes to this interface that we're just not, we haven't been doing. But to your point, Chuck, I think it's this really exciting opportunity and heavily overlooked. Yeah. Great.
Let's move on to Steve. So Steve, you sort of emphasized the use of plastics, particularly the polyurethanes. One of the interesting questions we got is there a way to create a bioplastic that's food safe and can be shelf stable for a year? And this particular person mentioned that they have a client with a beef stick product like Slim Jims, but way better, and is looking for one.
Okay. Yeah, there's a couple ways to answer that. So in order to get biodegradation, you need a polymer that can biodegrade, you need organisms to biodegrade it, and you need water 24/7. What I always tell the students in my lab is the reason there's mummies in Egypt is not because they had bodies that didn't biodegrade, it's because there was no water there. Okay. So you need all three of those, and as long as you keep things dry, they can stay a long time. They are food safe. All of the polyesters are. Sporks are made from those little plastic things we eat off. That's actually a biodegradable polymer. A couple of the other questions that are up here, and we want to go through these quick so we can stay on time. The biggest trash by far is single-use plastic. Food packaging is the #1 problem on the planet. But the problem that we discovered is if you go after those really bulk, huge things as you're starting, product, you'll quickly go out of business, right? And so we had to start with something that was higher value, and nothing's higher value than shoes. People pay a fortune for those silly little things because they're a fashion item, and yet they're a big a big part of the plastic waste as well. So we'll start with shoes. We'll start with other high value products. Yoga mats are coming next, and then eventually work our way down to making single-use plastic that we can rapidly biodegrade. And then a couple of the other questions are, you know, with algae, we can make polymers out of any of the lipid component. You can do it out of protein and other parts of it as well. But in general, we think about, let's use the lipid component for polymers, fuels eventually, I suppose, someday. And let's use the protein component for food, because as all the other speakers said, this is clearly something that we have to address. Okay, we should let Celina answer some of her questions up here too.
Yes, so all of these questions came in the chat really late, so I didn't get them down. So maybe you can look at the chat and select
and answer
them, because I couldn't keep up with them. They all came in at the last minute.
Yeah, thank you. These are great questions. Let's see, addressing Rod's question about including nutrient input requirements for microalgae. So kind of two of the next steps for our modeling will be to look at co-locating CO2 delivery and nutrient delivery for these systems. That can happen in kind of a variety of different ways. Some of them waste streams, others, especially for CO2, we're looking at direct air capture. So that is kind of the next step. And so I appreciate you raising the issue of nutrients. And then for the large raceway ponds for microalgae that have been around for a long time with limited products brought to market, what needs to happen for this tech to displace lower value end products from petroleum? And Steve maybe wants to jump in there as well. The system that we've been looking at is first cultivating in photobioreactors that allow quick growth of microalgae, which can then be put out into open raceway ponds, which then decreases the chance of fouling and also enables for faster and more cost and energy efficient production of microalgae. And currently what kind of microalgae producers have created a market niche for is nutraceuticals, which we think is then a promising indication that protein production and kind of first niche products, but then also widely available protein to feed the world is kind of that inroad that the petroleum alternatives sort of haven't been able to do market-wise, right? Microalgae for biofuels, third generation biofuels has been around for a while, but hasn't quite been able to outcompete oil. I'll stop there.
Okay, it looks like we've actually reached the end of our time for the Q&A. Sorry, guys, that we couldn't get to everybody's questions. So we're going to move on now to the next hour of presentations, and these are going to be e-lightning poster talks. We have 9 of them, and the way this is going to work is that we will have each of the presenters, give a presentation. It is a 3-minute recorded presentation, so that's the e-lightning part of it. And then after we're done with those, we'll have a breakout session, and those in attendance can go to whichever one of the breakout rooms they want to explore further based on the e-lightning talks. So let's start up with that, and we'll go with this first talk from Colin Beal.
Hi, I'm Colin Beal. This presentation is about techno-economic challenges associated with profitable production of fuel and feed from marine microalgae. For the results that I'm going to present today, they were produced from the 111 hectare facility model that we have used in prior publications, such as the 2015 paper shown here. This is a layout of that algae production facility, and it serves as the basis for this assessment. So that Techno-Economic Analysis control volume is shown here. It includes all of these steps: cultivation, harvesting, product separations into a biocrude and lipid extracted algae product. And we're going to consider 4 different parameters in the Techno-Economic Analysis that are shown here. Our approach will be to evaluate the impact of each parameter one by one, and while keeping the other 3 constant at their baseline. So I'll be showing 4 plots that consider the impact of each of these 4 things on the minimum fuel selling price of biocrude produced from this production pathway. The first chart here shows the minimum fuel selling price versus productivity. A lot of our analysis, we've used productivities in the 20 to 25 grams per meter squared per day range, which yields a minimum fuel selling price around $6 per gallon of gasoline equivalent. When the LEA is valued at $1,500 a ton, you're using free flue gas that's 10% CO2, and the capital cost for the facility is about $461,000 per hectare. The next chart shows the same thing as a comparison for capital cost, and essentially to achieve a biocrude price under $5 per gallon of gasoline equivalent with the system described here, it would require capital costs that are under $400,000 per hectare. Similar chart shown here for carbon cost. In this current model, even a free carbon, free flue gas with the parameters shown here results in a biocrude cost that's over $5 per gallon gasoline equivalent. And lastly, a comparison of the minimum fuel selling price versus lipid extracted algae value, which essentially shows a value over $1,500 per ton is required for profitable operation under $5 a gallon. Thank you.
Aloha and good morning. For this e-poster, I will briefly introduce you to the very ambitious and pioneering Red Sea and Amala regenerative tourism projects that are currently being developed along the Red Sea coast of Saudi Arabia as part of the Kingdom's Vision 2030 initiative. To achieve our exceptionally ambitious goals to enhance or regenerate the environment, to achieve carbon neutrality or better, and to sustainably produce much of our food locally, we are essentially pioneering a large-scale marine circular bioeconomy. Together, the Red Sea and Amala aspire to be the world's most ambitious tourism and hospitality projects. We are setting new standards in regenerative tourism, and we're positioning Saudi Arabia on the global tourism map. As these photos show, the Red Sea and Amala are home to spectacular natural beauty, thriving and biodiverse ecosystems, and abundant wildlife. These are the foundation and driver of our tourism destination, the reason visitors will come. Combined, the special economic zone being established for the 2 projects covers 20,000 kilometers squared and has a total shoreline of 818 kilometers. As the primary tourism driver is the natural beauty and biodiversity of our environment, we are committed to pioneering new global standards for environmentally sustainable development. Rather than adopt existing global best practices, which are aimed at minimizing negative impacts of development, we are proactively striving to enhance the environment, to make it better, hence regenerative tourism. As there isn't time to discuss each of these environmental commitments, here I will highlight our commitment to being carbon neutral or even climate positive, which includes sequestering all of the emissions associated with getting to and from our tourism destination. In addition, and perhaps even more challenging, we are striving to enhance conservation value, defined by biological diversity, by 30% by 2040. To achieve these ambitious goals, we are embracing a marine circular bioeconomy. Our efforts to achieve a circular bioeconomy are integrated into almost everything we do, including 100% renewable energy, clean mobility, nature-based solutions to sequester carbon, including habitat enhancements of 30% for native land vegetation, mangroves, and seagrasses, large-scale marine microalgae production, sustainable food and biofuel production, and the 4 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove. We plan to use large-scale marine microalgae for capturing carbon, producing food, biofuels, and other products. We plan to sustainably grow much of our food locally to reduce and remove carbon and provide food security. Thank you very much. I look forward to questions.
Hi, everybody. I'm Raj Fujita with the Environmental Defense Fund. Welcome to my talk on growing seaweed, opportunities, challenges, and solutions. Many of you know that seaweed farming brings many benefits to human society and to natural ecosystems. Seaweeds are capable of producing nutritious food, as well as biogas and many types of nutraceuticals and hydrocolloids. They generate lots of livelihoods, they're capable of enhancing fisheries, and there's even a potential to increase gender equity as more women tend to engage in seaweed aquaculture than in capture fisheries or other kinds of aquaculture. And in addition, there are so many benefits for natural ecosystems. Seaweeds, whether they're natural forests or seaweed farms, can provide some habitat for biodiversity. They can also protect nearshore habitats and shorelines from storm surges. And there's a lot of promise for using seaweeds to create substitutes for fish meal and fish oil and aquafeeds, as well as for plastic materials. There's even potential for seaweeds to contribute to the drawdown of atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, to mitigate against global warming, and also to reduce methane emissions from cows and other ruminants. Seaweed farm production grew rapidly and actually tripled between the year 2000 and 2018, according to the FAO. But in recent years, this growth rate has slowed down quite a bit. And the question is why? And how can we accelerate seaweed production so we can gain the many benefits associated with seaweed production? Here I've listed some of the major barriers and solutions to the expansion of seaweed farming that I found in the literature. They include things like product quality consistency, which can be addressed by creating industrial parks so that farmers can share testing and quality control processes, as well as the development of bioreactors that can produce refined products from seaweed. Congestion in nearshore waters is often cited as a barrier, and this can be addressed through marine zoning and perhaps by a move to offshore waters. Regulatory complexity and costs are often cited as barriers too, and this can be dealt with by streamlining regulations, as well as perhaps by including some pre-commercial siting and impact studies to reduce costs and increase access. Social license is often cited as a barrier, and this can be addressed by performance standards in regulation, as well as farmers posting bonds to reduce risks and to ensure compliance. Zoning can also play a role by separating conflicting uses on the water. Access to capital is a perennial concern, particularly for smallholders who currently dominate global seaweed production. And this can be addressed by the formation of more cooperatives, as well as by hybrid investment instruments that can increase the number of investable entities and get capital flowing to them that way. And market bottlenecks could also be a problem. Even though there's a huge potential for new products coming from seaweed, it's going to take some research and development and marketing to get those market channels developed. I hope you'll send me other barriers and solutions that you know about to rfujita@edf.org. Thanks for your attention.
Hi, my name is Arjun Pillai-Hausner, and I'm a current graduate student at Cornell University. Today I'm going to speak about the potential for algae in the supply chain for human nutrition. So seafood production is increasing. It's increasing both overall, as you can see in pink, and it's increasing in aquaculture and marine capture. Though it looks like capture is not increasing as much, that's because of how much faster aquaculture is actually increasing. So capture fisheries have been increasing at a relatively constant rate for the past few decades. Though production is increasing so rapidly, it cannot keep up with demand. In fact, according to the FAO, in a 2017 report, in the next decade, demand is expected to increase by about 47 million tons. Meanwhile, production is expected to increase by only about 19 million tons. There's this 28 million ton demand gap. Another thing just to note, as aquaculture increases rapidly, so has fish meal. Fish meal is also tied to wild capture as well. the global demand for protein is increasing rapidly as well. And this is not just protein from seafood, this is total protein. Wild-caught fisheries are also increasingly becoming overexploited. Currently, about 1/3 of all fisheries are overexploited. If we want to preserve ocean biodiversity, it's critical that we reduce our impact on fisheries. Fisheries also have a range of direct impacts on climate change. Different fisheries have sort of different amounts of carbon impacts, and you can see that range here. Most of their impacts are somewhere between that of pork and beef, and this is all direct impact, not more indirect emissions or opportunity cost. Feed conversion ratios for wild-caught seafood can also be incredibly high. A feed conversion ratio is the ratio of input to output from feeding an animal. So for example, if an animal had a feed conversion ratio of 10, that means that you would have to provide that animal 10 pounds of food for every 1 pound of fish product. So in that case, 90% of that food that you're inputting is actually going to waste. So another thing to note, and I've just begun doing this research, is that there may be a nutritional difference between farmed fish and wild-caught fish. This is really early work, not conclusive, but it does look like there are some slight differences. The example shown here is how, in this data set that I'm working with, there seem to be slightly higher cholesterol levels in farmed fish than wild-caught fish. And keep in mind, this is a fairly small sample size of about 22 and 25, and so that sample size will increase as I continue to do this work, and it's not a statistical difference. The p-value is about 0.5. This is work that I'll continue. Algae provides a solution to a lot of these problems. Algae have higher productivity, which are 1 to 2 orders of magnitude greater than that of certain terrestrial crops. You can also use otherwise non-productive or non-arable land to produce algae. Algae has the potential to provide the really important nutritional benefits of seafood. It can be produced more effectively than current production. It can fill the demand gaps that we have, and it doesn't rely on ocean biodiversity and ocean ecosystems. It has a much lower climate and biodiversity impact.
My name's Ryan Hunt. I'm the co-founder and chief technology officer for Algix and our brand Bloom. Our journey started back about 10 years ago when we became very concerned about the climate crisis and how we are burning large quantities of fossil fuels and releasing that carbon into the atmosphere. At the same time, we're refining the oil into plastics and trash that ends up polluting our lakes, our rivers, and our oceans. We looked at algae as a potential solution, and while naturally occurring around the world, it also has a wide range of negative consequences. We found that harmful algae blooms were plaguing countries all around the world, leading to a variety of social and environmental issues. These algae blooms are being fueled by elevated concentrations of carbon dioxide, a warming climate, and an excessive amount of water pollution entering the environment. When we look at algae, algae represents one of the oldest classes of organisms on the planet and grows 10 to 100 times faster than plants and trees. Algae produces more oxygen and captures more carbon than all of the forests on the planet combined. Yet somehow humans have yet to harness algae as a renewable resource. That is what our brand Bloom is all about. We take harmful algae blooms and convert them into renewable materials. We take polluted water and we produce clean water. We intercept carbon emissions from factories and utilities, and we capture that carbon in a durable state, in a pellet. And we transform linear, wasteful manufacturing processes into more circular and regenerative manufacturing processes. Our technology works like this. We work with governments, utilities, and private companies to capture and harvest algae blooms from polluted areas. We take that algae and it's harvested, it's dewatered and dried into a powder, and we use extrusion to combine the algae biomass with a wide range of different polymers to produce our algae bloom pellets. These pellets contain 45% algae biomass by weight and capture the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus extracted from the environment. We then release the clean, filtered, and oxygenated water through that process back to the environment, restoring balance to the habitat. Our compounds can be blended with a wide range of different materials depending on the end-use applications. We have a portfolio of elastomeric compounds that use EVA and different grades of TPE that can be used in a wide range of industries. This allows us to provide companies a sustainable option that can plug directly into their existing supply chain. Brands that are adopting the Bloom materials are helping us support lake restoration and environmental protection projects. And by creating a market for the algae biomass, we're able to valorize and incentivize industry to intercept their pollution prior to it being released into the environment, leading to an overall more environmentally sustainable process in the world. Our current production capacity is at the commercial scale. We have the ability to deliver algae content to over 200 million pairs of shoes per year. We work with over 200 factory partners in Southeast Asia and in Europe, and a few here in the US. And we have over 100 consumer product brands that are using Bloom materials in their products, helping us raise the awareness of algae as a renewable resource and quantitatively improving the sustainability metrics of their products. Here are a few examples of some of the brands that have joined our community and some of the celebrity allies such as Kelly Slater and Jason Momoa, who are creating products using Bloom and helping improve the sustainability of our planet.
Hi, I'm Zachary Johnson. I'm at Duke University and I lead the Marine Algae Industrialization Consortium. And today I'm just going to give a lightning talk about our efforts to develop marine microalgae as a driver of the circular bioeconomy. We have a fairly long history in this space, and it started with the development of Celina, moved on to awards with from DOE and USDA to Cornell University, and currently MAGIC, the Marine Algae Industrialization Consortium, has three major projects that all focus on developing marine microalgae as a platform technology to produce biofuels and other high-value bioproducts. And we have support from DOE and USDA and some other sources. And we're a mixture of both small and large private institutions, as well as several academic institutions too, which really is a reflection of the broad level of technologies and expertise that are as part of this consortium. So this is an overview of what we seek to accomplish with a little help from my daughter. And just briefly, marine microalgae are really at the center of this. They use CO2. Marine microalgae have products that can be used as for oil. They can be used as food for people. They can be used as feed for animals, both poultry and seafood and others. We've developed technologies and continue to develop technologies to utilize that CO2 more efficiently or to capture it from industrial sources like breweries. And we also seek to circularize the economy by integrating grain and other sources. And so really the vision here is to use the marine microalgae as the driver of the system. It's photosynthetic, just like in natural ecosystems. It's the engine of this circular economy. And we're trying to extract all the value and the different products that we can to link up these different boxes. And so this just gives you a broad sense of what our consortium does. Just in summary, this is a big team effort that, again, involves many different members that bring together different expertise, from selecting the algae to growing it at scale, what you see here, to harvesting it, extracting the different components, testing out those products, and looking at the overall life cycle and economics of that process. And so I really want to thank all of our members for that. We're supported by the Department of Energy, USDA, and National Science Foundation. And I hope that you take a look at our poster and learn a little bit more about a consortium. Thank you very much.
My name is Trig Lundquist, and I'm here with a lightning poster about improving the sustainability of land-based aquaculture with microalgae to treat the wastewater. My co-authors and I are from either microbioengineering or Cal Poly State University, both in San Luis Obispo, California. We can see in the top two bullets how much wastewater conventional aquaculture produces. The flows are high, the nutrient discharge can be quite high, and this needs to be solved if we're going to have an expansion of aquaculture. There are simple ways to do it, basically treat the water in the pond, but that's rather inefficient and uses a lot of land. There's other methods, but the one I'm going to focus on is the bottom bullet. These are processes with co-products. Sea lettuce systems have been tested in several countries, algal turf scrubbers, and my main topic, algae raceways. Microbioengineering has developed over many years the Renew process. It's used primarily for municipal wastewater treatment, but would work well for aquaculture also. These shallow raceways are up to 1 meter deep, and the paddle wheels slowly turn, moving the water at 15 to 30 centimeters a second, providing a well-mixed, very algae-rich environment which performs treatment at a high rate and with high efficiency. Once we've grown the algae, we can harvest it by several ways. These are methods developed by microbioengineering and Cal Poly. Bioflocculation, again, with sedimentation. You can see a full-scale settling basin on the lower left that's been decanted to show about 100,000 gallons of algae slurry. But over the past 4 years, we've also been developing filamentous algae, which are very easy to harvest. And finally, we can filter by a variety of ways as needed. The idea is to produce co-products, and here's a picture of Bloom footwear, which we will hear about from Ryan Hunt in this session. And there's a variety of other products that can improve sustainability and revenue for the aquaculture operation. In terms of water treatment, we have here nitrogen removal on the left. Even in winter, we can remove the nitrogen to strict discharge limits thanks to nitrification. And then on the right, we have phosphorus removal, and again showing it's possible to meet extremely low discharge limits using algae. If you have any questions, please contact me at that email address.
I'm Neil Anthony Sims, the CEO of Ocean Era, and I want to talk about offshore aquaculture and how we can use commercial incentives to achieve the conservation imperatives that we all see. We recognize the global these 6 global imperatives, and we believe that offshore aquaculture can address these through increased production of macroalgae and other marine-based foods, shifting from terrestrial animal protein production. Offshore aquaculture offers synergies with other fishing interests through the fish aggregation device effects, and it also allows us to scale offshore production with minimal ecological footprint, such as these sorts of constructions that are being deployed now offshore in Norway and in China. Our company is focused on macroalgae research and finfish research. For the macroalgae work, our Bluefields project is developing systems for culturing macroalgae offshore in tropical waters where the oligotrophic waters limit the normal natural propensity for growth of macroalgae. This is funded through the Department of Energy ARPA-E project, and it works on a swivel point mooring with a wave-driven spar pump to be able to provide the nutrients from deep seawater. And then we also have another project we call the Crumbs, focused on adaptation of the microbiome of herbivorous fish as a model for macroalgae deconstruction. The fundamental question here is how come fish such as the kyphosids or the rudder fish, how come they are so efficient at converting macroalgae to proteins and to energy? And we're collaborating with a number of stellar institutions there. Both of these projects are supported by ARPA-E's the ARPA-E division of the US Department of Energy. Our marine finfish work is looking at novel species such as herbivorous fish like the kampachi and mahi-mahi, transitioning to more sustainable feeds, and pioneering in offshore permitting, particularly in the US. And we see this as a way to address the global seafood challenge, to find alternative sources of proteins and oils, and actually we've been able to move on to a zero fish meal, zero fish oil diet for fish such as kampachi. and then to be able to develop herbivorous fish culture such as the kyphosids, and then also pioneering offshore, both in the Gulf of Mexico. We have a demonstration project and we have a commercial permit application in Oahu in Hawaii. The Gulf of Mexico project is in US federal waters. Initially, it's a demonstration pen to be able to show the community and to be able to garner the social license for a commercial permit. And then we're moving forward with a commercial permit application off Oahu, where this will be an integrated fish and limu or sea macroalgae farm on a site that was formerly permitted for moi culture. And we will be applying to culture both moi and kyphosids, mahi-mahi and macroalgae, using a swivel point mooring system similar to our macroalgae array so that we can be integrating the nutrients in the effluent water from the fish to stimulate macroalgal growth and to reduce the effluent impacts. Thank you very much. I look forward to speaking to you more. Aloha.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eugene Wang. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Sophie's Bionutrients. Today, I want to talk about microalgae for foods. This is a very different topic than previously what a lot of research on microalgae for biofuel and microalgae for nutraceutical ingredients. Well, the reason why we're interested in this topic is because of this question. What are we going to do when this planet Earth will be having 10 billion people by the year 2050? Well, we all know that when that happens, all these issues will happen. And when these issues happen, question is how much land we have left for food production. And so that's why we envision this picture. With the animal and current industrial agriculture plant-based protein being very premium on the top of the pyramid, we need to grow microorganisms for our foods, especially for our protein down the road in the future, to support the majority of the needs of the people on this planet. So why microorganism for foods? Well, number one, it avoids all the ethical issues. And secondly, because they all grow really fast. So on a per unit basis, all the water energy they need is very, very little. And don't forget, a lot of technologies we have developed to grow these microorganisms today does not need any of these chemicals in the process of their growth. Really healthy to the environment and the human body and make it really safe as well. And using the technology we have available, we can easily scale up the production and make it more efficient, make it low energy and even low pollution. And don't forget, a lot of these operations can be done inside a building, so it's not easily affected by the weather. That limits the price fluctuations like we saw today with the industrial agriculture and even animal farming. So why microalgae is superior? Well, quite frankly, recent fossil record just confirmed that microalgae is the mother of all the living things. And so they have a lot more nutrients than other groups of microorganisms. And on top of that, it has this wonderful lipid. You can not only just make it into biofuel, you can also make it into wonderful cooking oil as well. And more importantly, it can be grown in freshwater, brackish water, and even seawater. So make it possible for us to grow foods in extreme conditions for the first time in the human history with these microorganisms. But issues remain. Things like color, flavor, consumer perception, even pricing, and some regulatory issues we have to conquer. But in any case, we still have a lot of microalgae to explore. Sky is not even the limit. So let's go on and explore this opportunity to make it our main food sources. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, that was quite a number of thought-provoking e-lightning talks. I hope you all enjoyed them. And now you'll have an opportunity to go into chat rooms to talk with each of the speakers and ask your questions then and interact with them directly. So we're going to turn to that phase of the project, and here you go. All right, well, here we are. We're back. I hope you all found it a fruitful opportunity to interact with our speakers. We are now going to move on to the next set of invited talks. These will be 3 talks. The first is by David Babson, who will be presenting on an ARPA-E perspective on the bioeconomy and agricultural innovation. That will be followed by Mark van Keitz, who will be giving the ARPA-E perspective on bioenergy and climate applications. And the third talk will be Shauna Oh, who's the director of California Sea Grant, and she'll be giving Sea Grant's perspective on marine aquaculture. So this is our opportunity to sort of look at the federal agencies' perspectives on these topics. Okay, let's go with the first one.
Hello, my name is David Babson. I'm a program director with the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about my vision and the agency's vision for a new carbon economy, one that captures, uses, and stores more carbon than it emits, and specifically about the opportunities in ocean farming and blue carbon that can contribute to our vision for this new carbon economy. First off, who is ARPA-E? ARPA-E is the Department of Energy's high-risk, high-reward moonshot funding agency. Our goal is to overcome long-term and high-risk technical barriers and to realize transformative technologies that will contribute to a really advanced futuristic vision for a sustainable economy. ARPA-E is a relatively new agency, within the Department of Energy. It's only about 12 years old at this point. It was first authorized in 2007, but didn't receive its first funding until 2009. And in this short period of time, the agency's really distinguished itself and developed a lot of substantial programs and has a lot of important impact factors to show for it, including the total amount of spending that we've been able to put out in awards, a number of companies that have been started, the follow-on funding, the number of projects that have been funded, the patents and the peer-reviewed papers. All of these things are cumulative from many years of advanced research at ARPA-E, and we're very proud of what we've done and where we're going. And the types of solutions we're trying to offer are those precisely what you would expect from the Department of Energy's Advanced Research Projects Agency. We're trying to offer resilient energy infrastructure, affordable, sustainable energy, U.S. economic development opportunities, and leadership, global leadership in science and technology. But the things that I think about, the things that motivate the thinking for my programs is climate change mitigation. And we have a tough path to follow to keep global temperatures below 2 degrees of warming. In this plot here, you see the path that we need to follow. And the red line is the path that we need to track. Those are net emissions on a global basis per year. And this path will keep us below 2 degrees. At this point, all paths to 2 degrees go through zero. Our ability to just reduce emissions even down to zero and avoid more than 2 degrees of warming, that passed us by in the 90s. We didn't do enough. And now we need to actually build and implement strategies that will offer substantial negative emissions to contribute to net emissions to achieve our goals. The blue shaded area under this curve, under the zero line, are the net negative emissions that we need to be able to realize over the long term. And as you can see, the contribution of negative emissions is quite substantial even before this crossover point. This is to say that we need to build the strategies and to begin deploying the strategies to service this negative emissions industry immediately. In fact, the amount of negative emissions is quite large. This plot shows we need to achieve about 10 gigatons of carbon removal per year by 2050. And by 2100, we need to achieve the capacity of 20 gigatons of carbon removal per year. So just how big is 20 gigatons? To put this in perspective, you have to add up a number of different material flows to get there. First off, you'd have to take all the material flows in the US trucking industry, all of the boxes that are transported in Amazon and materials and those things that you see on tractor trailers. That's only 9.8 gigatons. You'd have to add on top of that all the material flows through US pipelines. That would give you another 3 gigatons. And then put on top of that global cement production, and global iron ore production. And cumulatively, these would be about 20 gigatons per year. This is to say that one of the largest industries on the face of the earth in 2050, and certainly by 2100, is going to be carbon removal and management. And from the Department of Energy standpoint, we need to ensure that this industry can be serviced with technologies that are both low cost and energy efficient. And there's a number of different ways to get there, including biological strategies, engineered strategies, and hybrid strategies. Biological strategies are those that leverage the natural carbon cycling in environmental systems and develop technologies to augment their capacity to remove and store carbon in these systems. Engineered approaches, including direct air capture, direct ocean capture, enhanced weathering and mineralization, engineer specific systems that remove and store carbon and can be scaled in a manner without respect to environmental constraints or land constraints. And hybrid approaches take advantage of upstream the natural carbon cycling of biological systems and then match up that accumulated carbon, whether it's in terrestrial or ocean biomass, to downstream engineered strategies that avoid that stored carbon from getting back in the atmosphere. This can include things like building with biomass, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or biochar. These hybrid systems can also be scaled, but are limited to some of the ability to get that carbon upstream. One of the things I'd like to note here, given the scale, the size of this future negative emissions industry, no one silver bullet technology or approach exists. All of these different strategies are going to have to be developed and deployed simultaneously, and the barriers that are preventing their cost-effective deployment and in servicing ambitious climate goals need to be tackled now. And in fact, once these technologies are developed, they will need to be strategically deployed into environments and into local economies that make the most sense for that particular strategy. And so, this future industry is definitely going to be very broad and very distributed. And one of the things that won't change, even as we deploy these negative emission strategies, is that we will still live in a carbon-based economy. Our future economy is still one that will, necessitate the production of iPhone cases and carpets and chemicals and materials that are carbon-based, including fuels. And our efforts to reduce and manage carbon won't so much enable a low carbon economy as much as a new carbon economy. So the technologies that will allow us to service the needs for carbon-based products while also servicing this negative emissions industry are going to be critical. And this is the context for the future bioeconomy. And there are a number of different drivers that we need to consider that are going to influence the profitability of end-to-end bioeconomy strategies, whether the feedstocks come from terrestrial systems or they come from ocean systems. The drivers are going to be the same, and the opportunities are going to be availed to ocean systems and others that spare land and reduce emissions. Because these factors are, one, reducing emissions, and two, sparing land, there's a new way of thinking about how you need to optimize around multiple variables in this space at the same time. Just as I was mentioning that we have to reduce GHG emissions down to zero and then go negative, we have to do the same on the land side. We need to innovate such that we can produce the same amount of food and products and materials that we do from our ag system. As our ag system is currently expanding and taking over more and more natural lands, we need to slow this rate of conversion down to zero and actually get to a point where we can reverse and begin re-inhabiting and re-engineering natural lands that are being converted from ag lands. So we need to take that in reverse. Now, in the carbon space, one thing to realize here is that in the future bioeconomy, where we are producing carbon-based products and we're servicing this negative emissions industry, the actual carbon attributes are going to become the most valuable piece of the bioeconomy in the future. The individual products themselves will become more valuable by being more sustainable and being more lower carbon on a carbon intensity basis. So the traditional view for bioeconomy products, their value could be augmented by increasing their sustainability by reducing the carbon intensity of fuels or cleaners or plastics or textiles, such that the companies that were purchasing these lower carbon alternatives were more sustainable and therefore more valuable to them in terms of meeting long-term commitments. But now we've actually even seen companies going further, corporations making greater commitments, not just to lower carbon products for their supply chains, but for specifically negative emissions to, in the case of Microsoft, offset all of its prior historical emissions, or Delta, to achieve carbon neutral by certain dates, and so on and so forth. And there's many, many other examples of this. And so being able to identify and valorize and realize negative carbon attributes while simultaneously producing low carbon products is absolutely critical. And beyond, beyond the individual technologies that ARPA-E is investing in, we are going to need to simultaneously implement numerous advanced research programs and efforts to actually get to this place where our economy can be not just carbon neutral, but carbon negative. This is going to include new research in terrestrial systems and agriculture, but also beginning to realize the opportunities that ocean systems can offer in land sparing and carbon mitigation and carbon management. And this is, all of these different areas of research are not all necessarily areas that ARPA-E is funding, but are areas that must be simultaneously invested in to achieve these ends. Let me talk quickly about what ARPA-E is investing in, and talk about where we can go to realize more opportunities for ocean systems, and then I will wrap up. So ARPA-E has its bioeconomy research has largely focused on terrestrial systems in the past. We have a number of different programs situated along the bioeconomy supply chain that will allow us to simultaneously deliver carbon-based products that are necessary for our future economy, as well as the negative emissions pathways that are going to be necessary to service a negative emissions industry. These programs include Terra and Roots, Smart Farm, and EcoSymbio. And let me quickly go through which each of these does. The Terra and Roots program was a program designed to enable the production of new systems and sensors and robots to collect better data sets for both above ground systems, that was Terra, and below ground root systems, that was Roots, such that we could connect plant phenotypic information to genotypic information so that we could more rapidly engineer crops for a changing climate, as well as to be more carbon efficient. The Smart Farm vision was to make it possible and profitable to optimize for both yield and carbon storage at the same time. This will allow a future ag system to be able to monetize farm practices and connect them to carbon markets. We don't have the technologies to actually measure the carbon harvest in terrestrial systems. And so we can't get to a place where we could pay farmers for their carbon management performance only practice until we have the tools to do that. And the Smart Farm program seeks to enable the production of those technologies. One other area where we are investing is in the conversion space. And this is, the particular inputs can be very agnostic. It can include terrestrial biomass, but it could also include biomass that was, produced in ocean systems. The EcoSymbio program recognizes a couple different things. First, we're deploying more wind, more solar. The cost and the carbon intensity of power is going down, and the cost of wasting carbon is going up. And to this end, this program seeks to kind of connect both the renewable energy circular economy to the carbon bio-based economy, such that we can leverage low-cost, low-carbon power to drive carbon efficiency improvements in the synthesis of valuable fuels, chemicals, and products for the bioeconomy. Another area where we don't have a focused program yet, but we've been investing, are some of these engineered carbon removal strategies. These include both direct air capture and direct ocean capture. And finally, I want to end on a note of talking about where things can go in the future. So we have our established ARPA-E programs that are enabling us to engineer crops more efficiently and more quickly. We're enabling the tools to actually measure carbon attributes in terrestrial systems. And there is an opportunity to expand these to ocean systems, to actually think about how we might engineer both terrestrial systems and ocean systems to be carbon removal and management vehicles. One of the things about offshore systems that's going to be extremely important for the growth of this sector is that we're going to need 10 to 14,000 CO2 injection wells to actually store the amount of carbon that we need to achieve our climate goals. One of the places that we can do that is offshore. There's a dirty legacy of recovering oil from systems at sea, and there needs to be a lot of advanced research investments to actually reverse that, leveraging the infrastructure that's in place at these wells to actually take a CO2 removed from the oceans, pressurize it to supercritical, and to pump it back down into the geological formations from which the oil came, storing it so that we can reverse the harms of the climate impacts of these legacy systems. So let me say, this is my vision for a carbon negative ocean bioeconomy. The ability to expand the sources of carbon inputs and biomass inputs from terrestrial to ocean systems as well, to include, feed, food, fuels, chemicals, materials, all being produced sustainably while sparing land and addressing climate change. And then also thinking about how we leverage and ensure our ocean systems can become negative emissions and carbon removal places that do it safely. These can include biological approaches like coastal blue carbon and engineered aquatic systems, direct ocean capture, and even hybrid strategies for ocean systems where you would match the accumulation of carbon in ocean biomass to strategies to either store it functionally or to store it on the bottom of the ocean. So thanks for having me. This is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out and discuss further with me. Thanks for having me.
Hello, my name is Mark van Keitz, and I'm a program director at ARPA-E. Building on my colleague Dave Babson's presentation, I would like to expand on the emerging opportunities for marine biomass to benefit energy and climate. Multiple studies on a US and global scale agree that biomass-based energy is a critical contributor to a future low fossil carbon energy mix. The key benefit of biomass is its versatility. We can turn it into liquid fuels, biogas or synthetic gas, heat and power, as well as electricity. And finally, we can also use it to sequester carbon. But the key question is really, can we produce enough of it? At this point, we are primarily focused on terrestrial sources, and there we run into competition with the production of food and feed, while at the same time experiencing constraints on the availability of agricultural land, and even more importantly, the availability of fresh water. So this is leading us to the idea that we need to look elsewhere, and no better place to look than the ocean. It's really the largest untapped growth opportunity for biomass, was covering over 70% of the world's surface. And for the US alone, it means that the exclusive economic zone is actually larger than all the land area across the 50 states. When we push out into the ocean, macroalgae are the quintessential ocean crop. And I'm sure you all are very, very familiar with that. There's thousands of different species. Many of them are growing very rapidly. And we have also managed to cultivate and harvest quite a number of those. These efforts go back over 400 years in Japan and have now grown into a large industry, mostly in Asia, that produces over 30 million wet tons every year. This material is mostly used at this point for direct food consumption and also for some industrial uses. However, if we want to think about using this biomass on an energy and climate scale, we need to scale up production by at least 100 times and drastically reducing cost. That will entail that we move further out to the open ocean environment and learn how to access the nutrients that are available there in sufficient quantities, but not always easily accessible. For this purpose, ARPA-E launched in 2016 the Marina Program, which is geared towards advancing macroalgae cultivation and harvest systems. Over 20 projects have been funded under this program with a total commitment of over $60 million. At the center of the program is a group of teams developing a diverse set of approaches to grow various macroalgae in a wide range of geographies and physical conditions. Still, they all are working towards a common set of metrics. There's the cost target of $80 or less per dry metric ton, and the scale of a farm of larger than 1,000 hectares. At the same time, these core teams are supported by several teams organized around capabilities in computational modeling, remote aquatic undersea monitoring, as well as breeding and genetic tools to advance the plants and slowly at least catch up to the several thousand-year head start that terrestrial agriculture already has. In addition to the core teams, we have very early on partnered with NOAA in order to bring in critical resources for spatial planning, to assess where are the best locations to deploy future farms. Secondly, we worked closely with Argonne National Labs to develop a macroalgae module within their GREET system to assess on a life cycle analysis basis the performance of the various solutions. However, scale is not just about the size of the farm, but in the end about the total amount of biomass that we are able to produce. And achieving large total volumes is not just a matter of technology, but it's equally important to have suitable markets available to which these materials can be supplied and that pull basically suction on the pipe. Here's an illustration of some of the potential markets that we foresee. And while the whole foods and hydrocolloids exist today, we see clear opportunities in ecosystem services and animal feeds, but also emerging opportunities in alternative proteins and biorefineries. Lastly, carbon capture tends to be the biggest of these, and the critical factor there will be, can we bring this in alignment with the necessary cost requirements? Inspired by the growing conversation on CO2 capture, we started in late 2018 to look what it would take to capture 1 gigaton of CO2 per year with macroalgae. We found that coincidentally, roughly 1 ton of CO2 is captured by 1 ton of dry macroalgae. With this assumption, and we looked at various scenarios, and in the most optimistic one, we found that 1 gigaton could be grown on 182,000 square kilometers. And don't nail me down on the exact number here. This is just a rough estimate, but it about corresponds to a little bit less than 2% of the total US EEZ. However, capturing the CO2 is only half the battle. If we are interested in long-term sequestration, we really need to understand what happens next. There is already a first step that is happening right alongside It's a cultivation, it's so-called cultivation-associated carbon sequestration. And there's a great group, Oceans 2050, that is currently supporting a study to better quantify these effects. But when we want to take the biomass directly, there's two big opportunities that we are seeing. The one thing is the deep ocean sinking of macroalgae, and you may have already heard some of this in other parts of this conference. And then there is bioenergy with carbon capture on storage called BACS. I want to touch on both of these here. So the area of scaling macroalgae sinking is still a big question. So we really need to first understand what is happening to the carbon once it's sunk in the long term. We also need to understand what are the best locations for sinking, and then what technologies do we need in order to do this cost effectively. Finally, it's always important to understand and closely assess what the effects of large-scale seaweed sinking are on the benthic ecosystem. And overall, we have to also keep in mind that once we sink the macroalgae, there is nothing that we can directly do with these anymore. So that's where BACS may offer a little bit of an alternative, because we can combine BACS with a macroalgal biorefinery and have then several opportunities to sequester carbon. When we take the macroalgal material and put it through an anaerobic digestion process, we produce biogas, which is a mixture of methane and CO2. In order to make a renewable natural gas that could be pumped into pipelines, we need to separate out the CO2, which can then be sequestered. Again, once the bio-RNG is in the pipeline, it can be burned at gas power plants that may be equipped with carbon capture and storage capabilities. And again, we can take the CO2 to make these systems actually carbon negative. What is further of interest is that we can actually take some of the high value components out of the macroalgae before they are put into the anaerobic digestion. While that reduces yield a little bit, it can contribute to some significant revenue increases. We need to understand, however, that we are dealing now with material that's very different than terrestrial biomass, and we are just starting to learn how to properly and effectively convert them. So one of our projects that we have been funding is one that is taking its cues from the microbiome of herbivorous fish to inform the anaerobic digestion process. Because what we ultimately need to achieve is very high yields from the carbon to the final product, and we also want to do that as quickly as possible. Besides carbon, there's still a lot of other things that are in the macroalgae. And up to 40 or more % are either ash, sulfur, nitrogen. And it's really an important area that is still just starting to be explored, what we could potentially do with that. Some people are actually looking right now if there are some rare earth elements that can be retrieved, and that's one of the projects my colleague is working on. And another opportunity that is really important is nitrogen, and this is where I want to focus on for the remainder of this talk. There's an interesting analogy that we could integrate food and fertilizer webs from ocean and land. It turns out that the Great Bear Rainforest in British Columbia derives 80% of its nitrogen from salmon, which has picked up this nitrogen in the ocean. And just a quick reminder, while we often are concerned that there's not that much nitrogen at the surface, as soon as we go down 100 meters and deeper, there is a nearly limitless amount of nitrogen. So it's just a matter of us understanding how we can tap into that And various strategies that we are looking at with the macroalgae cultivation are trying to just do that. So the big question now is, how can we really take advantage of this nitrogen? The simplest process would be to go just through the anaerobic digestion process that I talked about, and then take what nitrogen is concentrated in the biomass, either in the form of a single cell protein, or sometimes it's in the form of ammonia, both of which can be retrieved. There is also another way of directly taking the protein out of the macroalgae and then anaerobically digesting the remainder, which leaves us with some functional proteins that are potentially quite valuable. So just on a very high level mass balance, just to tell you how much nitrogen these macroalgae are actually able to capture, we are looking at roughly 2% as an average nitrogen content value across many species of macroalgae. For a gigaton of these macroalgae, we would be looking at 20 million tons of nitrogen. For reference, the United States used about 10 million tons of nitrogen on all of its major crops in 2020. So there's a really great opportunity. However, we're not quite there yet. There is still, in the whole space of macroalgae cultivation and utilization, quite a bit of scientific and technical uncertainty that we need to resolve. We definitely need to work on the economies of scale, from the supply chain to the marketplace stepping stones, and regulatory hurdles. We definitely need to find ways to effectively permit these large-scale offshore operations. And hand in hand with that goes social license. What we need to ensure is that we continue to have community acceptance for this technology, and a critical part of that is to be transparent in communicating and mitigating risks and unintended environmental consequences. So there's a lot to do, and we are really looking forward to working with you, but we have been making quite significant progress and are striving to grow a collaborative community to spur innovation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to any questions.
Hello, I'm Shauna O, Director of California Sea Grant, which is administered by Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego. I'm a member of the Ocean Visions Task Force on Marine Circular Bioeconomy, representing NOAA Sea Grant's interest and perspective in marine aquaculture. The title of my presentation is Role of Sea Grant in the Advancement of U.S. Aquaculture, Science-Based, Stakeholder-Driven, and Partnership-Focused Engagement. The co-authors of this presentation are my Sea Grant colleagues at the National Sea Grant College Program, Cola Garber, Chuck Wyrick, and Mark Rath, and LaDawn Swan, who is the director of the Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant Consortium and is also the Sea Grant Network Aquaculture Liaison. In the presentation, I'll cover NOAA Sea Grant, our investment in aquaculture, and highlight some examples from the Sea Grant aquaculture portfolio, and conclude with future direction, opportunities, and partnerships. The Sea Grant mission is to enhance the practical use and conservation of coastal, marine, and Great Lakes resources to create a sustainable economy and environment. Sea Grant uses a three-tiered approach to achieving its mission: basic and applied research, education, and outreach, the transfer of science information to end users by communications and extension. The integration of research, education, and outreach is the hallmark of Sea Grant. Sea Grant is a federal university partnership between NOAA, which stands for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and 34 university-based programs, or Sea Grant colleges, located in every coastal state, including those around the Great Lakes, Guam, and Puerto Rico. One of the 34 programs is the National Sea Grant Law Center, which is based at the University of Mississippi School of Law. Sea Grant acts as a bridge between government, academia, industry, scientists, and citizens, linking assets at universities and federal agencies with needs of citizens, businesses, and decision makers. NOAA's National Sea Grant Office, based in Silver Spring, Maryland, administers funding to the Sea Grant colleges and oversees several national funding competitions. The investments in research, education, and outreach are guided by the National Sea Grant Strategic Plan. Sustainable fisheries and aquaculture is one of 4 focus areas that addresses the Sea Grant Network's overarching priorities. As a NOAA-administered program, Sea Grant's vision and goals in sustainable aquaculture complement the vision articulated in the Department of Commerce's Strategic Plan, NOAA's priorities, and the NOAA Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research Strategy. The NOAA line offices that support aquaculture projects and activities include the National Marine Fisheries Service, Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, and the National Ocean Service. Sea Grant's aquaculture funding, shown in light blue, is comprised of the National Strategic Initiatives and the 34 Sea Grant program-based competitive state research projects in aquaculture. As you can see, Sea Grant funding is a sizable portion of NOAA's investment in aquaculture. National Strategic Initiatives are federal investments for aquaculture funding competitions run through the National Sea Grant Office. This bar chart shows that while funding for national strategic initiatives in aquaculture has been variable in the last 20 years, Sea Grant's budget has been growing since 2016, with current funding level at $13 million per year. In 2016, the 10-year NOAA Sea Grant Aquaculture Vision was published to guide the growing investment. 2 other vision documents were developed as part of the network's visioning efforts related to aquaculture: the Aquaculture Communication Strategy and the Integrated Fisheries, Aquaculture, and Seafood Vision. The 10-year vision describes a research, education, and outreach approach that fosters the expansion of a sustainable marine and Great Lakes aquaculture industry. The vision was developed with the guiding principles listed here around the 5 focus areas of the vision in the gray boxes: commerce, permitting, species development, optimization of production systems, and seafood safety and product quality. Sea Grant directs its investment to research, addressing industry bottlenecks and helping growers find answers to their questions, to education and training programs to foster seafood production and seafood safety, but also for the development of a current and future coastal and marine workforce, to communications, sharing the results and impacts of Sea Grant aquaculture projects, and working closely with local institutions to communicate and share messages about sustainable aquaculture, and to extension, which facilitates the flow of information between the broader aquaculture community and university-based professionals. I want to take a minute to further explain extension. Sea Grant Extension is the delivery of scientific research and knowledge to coastal communities and user groups. Extension professionals are trusted experts immersed in their communities. They make research matter at the local level by addressing local needs with original research or by extending research information from other members of the university community, while also transferring research priorities back to their universities. They work closely with Sea Grant communicators and educators, again connecting university resources and expertise. Those investments made over 50 years of Sea Grant's history have led to the commercialization of species and technologies. The 17 broad categories listed here represent the development and transfer of largely university-based investments in aquaculture research discovery and associated technology transfer. While there are many examples around the network, here in California, past and current funding from California Sea Grant and the National Strategic Initiatives have and continue to support researchers at public and private universities in the state. Research investigations into various aspects of reproduction, nutrition, physiology, hatchery practices, or disease have facilitated the development and continued support for the white sturgeon, red abalone, Pacific oyster, and seafood industries in California. Industry partners like those listed here have relied on Sea Grant-funded science-based information and extension services to cooperatively contend with threats to the industry. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck, small seafood businesses around the country were severely impacted. Many restaurants closed and the market for fresh farm shellfish dried up. Sea Grant began rapid response investment in the summer of 2020, allocating over $2 million to support the U.S. aquaculture industry. Several projects undertaken by 6 Sea Grant programs purchased farmed shellfish originally intended for local restaurants and repurposed it for restoration. Projects compensated farmers for shellfish that have grown too large for the half-shell consumer markets and planted them in hopes of further restoring natural beds. Not only did this solution aid in local restoration efforts, but it also provided immediate relief to aquaculture producers whose sales were impacted by the pandemic. California Sea Grant is also working with multiple partners, academic, federal, regional, state, NGO, and industry, to explore aquaculture solutions for restoration. California's coast has been experiencing dramatic declines in kelp forest ecosystems, and explosions of purple sea urchins that feed on kelp have prevented its recovery, leading to urchin barrens. The Kelp Recovery Research Program is funding projects to address key questions for restoration for both bull kelp and giant kelp ecosystems, including how to raise and outplant kelp, identifying and cultivating resilient strains, and creating a seed bank to preserve genetic material. Another approach for restoration, called urchin ranching, harvests the urchins and feeds them in aquaculture tanks to develop marketable roe. Urchin ranching could provide high-value seafood while restoring the ecological benefits of healthy kelp forests by financially incentivizing removal of urchins from the urchin barrens. With many more similar efforts around the country, the Sea Grant Network in 2020 reported $80 million of economic impact, with 408 aquaculture-related businesses created or sustained, and the creation or retention of over 1,000 aquaculture-related jobs as a result of the $16 million in national investment. Those metrics and impacts are possible through the continued and growing investment in aquaculture, both by the individual state Sea Grant programs and with funding from national strategic initiatives. I've listed the initiatives from the last few years, and information on the projects funded by these programs can be accessed at the National Sea Grant website. This year, the National Sea Grant Office and the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program are funding a joint competition to fund proposals that seek to establish, continue, or expand collaborations between researchers and the shellfish aquaculture industry to address impacts from multiple stressors. The National Strategic Initiatives facilitate Sea Grant researchers to share ideas, provide mechanism for Sea Grant extension professionals to collaborate, allow rapid response to challenges and disruptions to coastal communities, and support pilot projects to bridge individual research projects to federal aquaculture labs. Future national strategic initiatives will be guided by the results of the stakeholder input that is being collected to develop an implementation strategy for the Sea Grant 10-year aquaculture vision. My colleague LaDon Swan, in his role as the Sea Grant Network Aquaculture Liaison, has surveyed the Sea Grant Network for Phase 1 and is in the process of collecting external input from farmers, national industry groups, university scientists, NGOs, NOAA line offices, and other federal agencies. The survey asked open-ended questions on what challenges or problems Sea Grant should work on over the next 5 years under each of the 5 focus areas of the vision, and any other challenges that Sea Grant should address using its research, education, legal, extension, and communications capabilities. One of the key results of the internal survey that emerged is aquaculture literacy, the need for Sea Grant as a network to work on providing science-based information on aquaculture for educational purposes. To address aquaculture literacy, the North American Association for Environmental Education is supporting partnerships, sharing the mutual aquaculture literacy goals of NOAA's Office of Education, National Marine Fisheries Service, and the National Sea Grant Office. The EE Blue Aquaculture Literacy mini grants will provide informal learning institutions such as public aquariums, aquaculture industry, and NOAA partners and assets like Sea Grant with support for the co-development of innovative educational experiences. The intent of this partnership is to make aquaculture a more commonly understood topic, including what aquaculture means to different communities and what it takes to have a career in the field. By leveraging its locally based research and engagement programs, coordination with NOAA interests, and its long-standing history working in communities and with industry, Sea Grant is ideally positioned to play an expanded role for improving aquaculture literacy, but also to help the Department of Commerce and NOAA achieve their goals of increasing sustainable domestic aquaculture, creating jobs, and providing economic benefits to coastal communities. Thank you for listening. I look forward to answering any questions you may have during the Q&A for session 4. I've listed links to resources about funding opportunities and the work of the Sea Grant Network and California Sea Grant that I referenced during my presentation. Thanks again.
Hi, everybody. I'm not sure if I'm on. There we go. Yes, so we're going to go into the Q&A session right now. And again, I don't see a lot of questions in the chat box, so people can add those as they think of them. But I have a few questions that I came up with while the speakers were talking. And I guess the first one is a little bit of a comment that then leads into a question. And so I really liked David's presentation because it really linked the transition that has to occur from our sort of current land-based perspective on terrestrial agriculture for food and energy production in the future to, or energy production to what we need to do in the future that includes much more in the way of new ocean solutions. What I also liked about David's presentation is it emphasized the incredible magnitude of the challenges that we face. And that way it really sort of provided a nice introduction to Mark's presentation, which provided more detail on the possible ocean solutions. And then I listened to Shauna's presentation, and I guess what I was struck by is what I would call the new inconvenient truth. And I guess that's that when we look at sort of Sea Grant and other federal investments, we're looking at $1 million investments when the challenges that we face really require $1 billion investments. And, we're not used to, I think the way federal agencies are sort of approaching this, it's kind of, we've always sort of supported what I would call incremental science. And the problem is that the solutions to the problems that we're facing now have to be solved in the next couple of decades. And even if it takes another decade to figure out the technologies that are going to work for us at a global scale, it's going to take another decade or two to actually scale those up. And so we can't sort of continue to fund this with the sort of business as usual federal approach to funding. How are we going to make that jump? How are we going to accelerate these technologies so that we can really scale them up quickly enough to solve these problems? Because we're supposed to be carbon neutral in 3 decades. So I throw that out, and I'd actually like to hear each of you give us a little bit of your own perspective on that comment. So maybe start first with David, since he was the first speaker.
So which which question am I responding to specifically, Chuck? Sorry.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to, well, maybe any of you that want to jump in. I guess the question is, we have, you know, you emphasize the magnitude of the problem that we're facing, yet I don't see the federal response coming at the level that it needs to. I mean, we can't sort of continue funding science the way we have in the past because we just don't have enough time. So I'm just curious.
Well, stay tuned. I think there is, you know, a shift in thinking now about really taking stock of what the challenges are, and you know, some of the new program development is really driven by a clear-eyed view of what those challenges are that I outlined. That, you know, when you really take stock of the fact that, you know, we have to kind of simultaneously achieve a number of different miracles. We need to, you know, keep, you know, growing our economy, increasing prosperity, providing the necessary resources to a growing population while driving down emissions to zero, and then building out a huge new industry that will be, you know, the largest industry on the face of the earth to remove and store carbon, while also innovating in a way to produce more and make more from the land that we have, such that we can slow, you know, natural land conversion to ag down to zero, and then go the other way. And so when you add up all of the things that need to be done at the same time, it does seem very daunting. But I will say that at no other time that I've been in the government have I been more encouraged by the fact that there is a very frank discussion about these challenges, and you know, real serious conversations about what are the necessary investments to try to actually address them. So we have to wait and see. I think there will be more investments in these things and more targeted approaches and strategic plans to deliver the solutions we need. But I'll let Mark and others chime in and give their thoughts on that too.
Yeah, Chuck, just if I might be able to add a little bit to this. I think at least with regard to ARPA-E, we are really charged with funding transformational efforts. And I think that's really not so much a question of the total amount of money that we're putting in, but I think the key role that we're playing is actually asking the questions and directing the efforts into the areas that we need to de-risk. So it's not always just a total amount of money, but it's how smartly you're deploying that money. And I think that's an opportunity space that we, I think, across the government have to think about. How do we really measure that we are having success? How do we focus really on stepping stones and de-risking? And at some point, we also have to say, this is not worth continuing to do, because while at the same time, I want to echo what Dave said, that there's a lot of things that we need to make it happen. Not every idea that is being put forward is going to be successful in the long run. And we need to, part of at least the ARPA-E funding is help us sort through that. It's very similar to the investment with venture capitalists that oftentimes say, fail fast. It's like, so, and that's where it comes down to asking the right questions. And I think that's what we really have to do. And that's what we strive for in the programs that we are trying to put up. And the big thing is, and even if individual teams maybe not succeeding, the big thing is that we are helping to build a community. I put up the picture at the very end of my presentation with regard to the efforts of building a community. So we started this 5 years ago. At that point, there was really just, we had a few artisanal seaweed farmers in the US that had maybe a few long lines out there. And by now we have really grown into a very excited and community that is able to actually attract serious attention from other financing sources as well. And that's, I think, really what this funding is intended to do. We cannot hope that government is funding it all the way.
Let me clarify a point. First of all, one of the reasons I have two ARPA-E program managers participating in this is because I do think that ARPA-E is playing an incredibly important role in this and doing exactly what you said, basically taking a chance, at funding the development of potentially high-risk technologies as well as ones that are likely to move forward. I guess where I see the mismatch is that with Sea Grant is actually one effort within the Commerce Department to sort of figure out how we implement this, right? And that's where I see the gap. I see the gap between sort of the really good investments of funding in developing the innovative technologies at ARPA-E, but then there's this gap, and we seem to sort of be expecting the private sector to step in, and it's not really easy to get the private sector to step in right away because they have a business model that they're already following, and them following business as usual is often a lower risk proposition than getting into something entirely new. And to some extent, the Commerce Department needs to figure out how to step up and do more, either through Sea Grant or through other elements in NOAA, because I just don't see, it's one thing when you're talking about startups that require millions of dollars, because you can find investors that can do that. But when you're talking about things that are starting up for not necessarily high value products, but commodity products, which, they don't have large profit margins, right? So but yet it's those commodity markets that we have to be able to enter to achieve the scale that David was talking about.
So Chuck, yeah, I hear you, and in the term in relation to the other speakers, it's, for me, I wish we could say transformational for the budget, and you saw we're a tiny funder, we're not even a small funder, but I think what I was trying to get across was but incrementally, you're right, status quo is not going to work, but what's unique about Sea Grant, unlike the other NOAA line offices, is that we're trying to utilize the local communities, the businesses, as well as the university and other stakeholders within where we're placed to try to move the needle. Now, is $1 million or $13 million going to move that needle? I'm not sure, but this is where the leverage, the leveraging and I know at the higher level, as David said, that we're hopeful with the new administration, but this is going to come up again, I know, later. But perhaps the social license that we all talked about, and the voters, speaking with their votes, and really seeing where, in the next maybe 10 years, 20 years, that there is going to be an investment at that scale to address what you're talking about. But in terms of the gaps between what you saw ARPA-E and Department of Commerce, I can't speak to Department of Commerce or NOAA. Really, I can speak for Sea Grant, is that they are trying to partner more, to leverage more with, I think, David or Mark mentioned partnering with NOAA, the NOS for siting. And so we can do that. Do I wish our budget would be 10-fold, 100-fold? Sure, but that's not been the case. And so, at this point, leveraging the interests of those in the larger aquaculture community, whether that be researchers, NGOs, and certainly for the presentation I gave, the industry, to how do we get them to do this with us? So I wish we could say, I don't think I used the word transformational once. That's not possible with the funding that we have, but it is possible, like I said, I think incrementally with partners doing those things.
You know, one of the really important roles I think Sea Grant can play, not necessarily in the funding. I didn't really want to come down so negatively on Sea Grant about that. That's obviously beyond your control. But what Sea Grant does have is it has this relationship with local communities and with stakeholders. And one of the things that's going to hold back a number of these technologies is not just the funding, but also the regulatory environment and the permitting. You know, we had a discussion a couple months ago about, could we start up projects in California as demonstration projects? And it was like, well, when you start to look at the regulatory environment and the permitting requirements, all of a sudden you go, well, maybe this isn't the best place to start. And if you can't do it in California, that really says something. So I think that, you know, Sea Grant may play a really important role, not necessarily in providing funds, but in, you know, because of its connections with stakeholders and local communities, may be able to get the U.S. into a more receptive environment for really scaling these things up. Because, you know, it's pretty, I think right now, marine aquaculture, actually aquaculture at large, the U.S. is ranked 17th in the world. And if you look at marine aquaculture, as was pointed out earlier, you know, 99% of it's occurring in China. So there's a lot of room for growth in this country, but you know, we have to figure out how to get the funding, how to do the right technologies, and how to get the right environment to develop these.
Don't really mean to cut you off, but we had a few questions here in the chat, and I thought maybe we should try to still address a few of them. So I know that Steve Mayfield had one for Dave Babson that was regarding CCS underground. So I don't know if you can see it, Dave. I can also read it otherwise. So David,
I can't see it. Yeah, go ahead.
It says, David, I had heard that CCS underground or under the ocean was almost impossible due to the large amount of energy required to pump liquid CO2 underground. Yeah. Is there new thinking on how we might achieve CCS without large energy requirements?
No, it's going to require a large amount of energy to do it. And the reason is because the types of systems that I was outlining, and I just did a quick, very cursory overview of the vision of how you might leverage, you know, the in-place infrastructure to kind of reverse the flows of CO2 at offshore oil rigs. There's energy that's required to separate the CO2 from the ocean water, and there's another amount of energy that's required to pump it up to supercritical pressure or pressures necessary to pump it underground and store it and keep it underground. You can't get around the energy demands for these on an end-to-end basis, but there is new thinking on how you might engineer you know, modular deployable energy systems to power these processes autonomously at these remote locations. This could be taking advantage of wave power or, you know, offshore solar or wind at these sites, or even, you know, in some other particular considerations, folks have been looking at using the, you know, small scale nuclear reactors that are used to power submarines to power offshore carbon dioxide removal and management. But you can't get around that. There's a lot of innovation that'll need to be done to make this possible. But I actually liken this to the fact that we know that there's going to be an enormous industry. The oil industry today is enormous, and that there are geologists and mechanical engineers and chemical engineers along the entire oil supply chain that make it possible for us to take it from, you know, deep under the ocean and turn it into plastics and chemicals and fuels that are used on our daily lives. And it will take engineers and scientists along this reverse supply chain to figure out how we get CO2 out of the atmosphere and out of the oceans and back into those geologic formations. And that's really, I was just trying to highlight the fact that we need to think on that scale to do that, to realize this industry. But yeah, good question. Can't get around the energy issue. You're gonna have to figure out how to make it work.
Thanks, David. Chuck, I think we're out of time.
Okay. Yes, thank you. So now we are on to the next phase, which are the panels. And the first panel will be headed by Rod Fujita, and that'll all be done live. So I will hand this off to Rod now, and the panelists are Ryan Hunt, Zachary Johnson, Sinjin Lee, Simone Auget, and Rebecca White.
Thanks very much, Chuck. Well, I hope all of you have been convinced by now that microalgae and macroalgae can generate a huge number of benefits for society and for the environment. You know, this can also result in drawdown of atmospheric carbon dioxide to help mitigate climate change. But there's no free lunch, and there's plenty of challenges to growing both microalgae and macroalgae. And there's big questions about what to do with the biomass in order to maximize those benefits. So our panelists are going to talk about those challenges and ways to use macroalgae and microalgae to benefit the environment and society. And hopefully they'll share some solutions that they've come up with to overcome the barriers. Let me ask our panelists to just briefly introduce themselves, starting with our macroalgae specialist, Simona Auget and Rebecca White. And then we'll move on to Ryan Hunt, Zachary Johnson, and Sinjin Lee. So Simona, say a few words about yourself.
Great, thanks so much for having me. I'm stepping in for Neil Sims. So I'm the research manager at Oceanera, and I work on tropical macroalgal cultivation. My previous experience was working with temperate macroalgal cultivation, genetics, and breeding. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me as well. I'm Rebecca White. I'm the executive director for the Algae Biomass Organization. My background in the industry is I did production of various types of microalgae for biofuels, food, and feed for a little over 12 years before joining ABO. Thanks.
Thank you. Xingang?
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. I'm also a nutritionist at Cornell University. I use animals and chickens mostly and fish to evaluate the microalgae nutrition value from the biofuel production. And also I'm interested in using microalgae as also human foods.
Thanks. Ryan?
Hi, my name is Ryan Hunt. I'm the co-founder and chief technology officer for Algix. We created the brand Bloom, and we produce with our partners a sustainable ingredient for consumer products using algae.
Thanks, Ryan. And Zachary?
Hi, I'm Zachary Johnson. I'm at Duke University, and I lead the Marine Algae Industrialization Consortium. It's a group of academic and private groups that together seek to develop microalgae for sustainable production of feed, food, and fuel. Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks all you panelists. Let me start with the big stuff, the macroalgae. Simona and Rebecca, you both have experience in growing macroalgae, both at the lab scale and out in the ocean at large scales. Tell me about the challenges that you've encountered in growing a macroalgae at scale. Don't be shy. Either one of you can go.
Rebecca, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say a correction. I grew microalgae, not macroalgae. So I'll turn it over to you, Simona.
Okay, well, I'm sure there's a lot of similarities as well, but I mean, some of the biggest challenges I think for large scale production include starting off with clean strains and, you know, developing cultures that are free from any other contaminants. So that's really important for scaling up. So, you know, we deal with diatoms and epiphytes, and this is both in the lab hatchery stages, but also when we move out to the field and we have to deal with any other organisms that might be trying to grow on the farm. And this includes grazers as well, you know, maybe snails or any other ducks or birds, anything that could be trying to eat our crop. And in order to develop these clean strains, it's really important to have seed banks. So some kind of, you know, instead of just going and wild harvesting seaweed, it's important to have something to start with. And I know that for microalgae, you know, there's plenty collections, but for macroalgae, this is still kind of at the very early stages. So we really have to develop strains that we know are going to give us the biggest yields, are going to produce products that are thermally resistant, you know, resistant to diseases as well. And we know the genetics as well. So we know both the genotypes and the phenotypes. So the goals for us at Oceanera specifically, right now what we're doing is we're working with tropical macroalgae and trying to put these out on a farm offshore. So what we want to do is work in low nutrient environments. So I think, you know, whenever you're cultivating, you have to work with the species in your area and then also look at your environment and what are the challenges for your specific ecosystem. So for us in a tropical system, we have oligotrophic water. So the way that we're addressing this for our current project is to actually use an energy neutral wave pump to pump up deep sea water from you know, depths maybe 100 meters or so below the surface that's high in nutrients, and that's going to feed our macroalgae. So that's one approach.
Thanks so much, Simona. And here's a question for you, microalgae people. How do you overcome nutrient limitations? So you've got these microalgae growing in dense cultures, they're absorbing lots of carbon, they got exposed to a lot of sunlight. So imagine under those conditions, you get some nutrient limitation. How do you get the nutrients to them in a cost-effective and environmentally sustainable way?
So I'll go first. My background is farming microalgae in Texas and New Mexico, so in the Southwest, and we used primarily agricultural fertilizers, and we had set points, you know, low and high, that we would just maintain the phosphate, the different nitrogen species in between. One of the issues with this is that obviously agricultural fertilizers are problematic from a sustainability perspective. And so we were working on using different types of effluent that we could standardize. So we had some work with a local dairy farm, for example, to try and get a more sustainable nitrogen and phosphorus source for our ponds.
Thanks, Rebecca. Other thoughts on that, Zachary or Shenzhen or Ryan?
Yeah, I could make a quick comment on that. So with our supply chain for Bloom, one of our key elements is environmental restoration. So we're always looking for suppliers that are using the algae as a tool for environmental remediation, cleaning water, capturing carbon from either municipal, industrial, or agricultural sources. And that poses somewhat of a challenge depending on what you're going to do with the algae. If the waste stream is too dense, or it means that you have to produce a polyculture or a mixed species culture, that might limit what you can do with the material for a high value feed or extract. But for our process, you know, we can really take any biomass, aquatic biomass, and use the thermoplastic conversion techniques to turn that into a biomaterial, and we're relatively agnostic to the specific species. So that way it enables us to take a wide range of algae sources coming from these nutrient-rich, eutrophic, or wastewater treatment facilities, which really reduces the environmental impact on the production side.
Good point. And Zachary and Xinjian, you're both growing macroalgae, so how do you solve these nutrient limitation problems?
Yeah, I think we use a process pretty similar to what Rebecca described. I think it certainly is one of the challenges to sustainably source nutrients. But I think it's also worth remembering that that microalgae utilize nutrients very efficiently. And so, you know, unlike terrestrial agriculture where you might add it and it runs off, essentially, you know, pushing 100% of it is actually utilized by the product. And so that increases the overall efficiency of the process.
Thanks. Let me toss it back to Simona for a minute. So you're actually in the business of growing seaweed. Have you and your firm thought about, you know, what the best markets are to sell into in order to kind of balance your mission of, you know, being profitable, of course, but also maximizing environmental benefit?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rod, and it's definitely something we've thought about. I think for now, we're definitely super focused on the actual cultivation and just seeing how different species perform, again, under low nutrient conditions, under different temperature regimes. But we have thought about markets specifically. We're cultivating in Hawaii, and macroalgae are a big part of the diet. So, you know, you can find, you know, Gracilaria in poke, and, you know, there's Caulerpa, like the sea caviar. So there's potential to approach the food market, but our project currently is looking at biofuels. So I think, you know, there's different avenues that we'd still like to pursue. I think we're still, you know, looking at some different options and also seeing what the economics is of the whole cultivation system.
Thanks, Simona. And Shingen, I know that you're exploring a really interesting pathway involving the use of microalgae as an ingredient in aqua feeds. Can you tell us a little bit about how you see that developing over time?
Great question. So, I mean, as we had some talks today, you know, the major issue of feeding the world, feeding the animals, is the deficiency of protein. So in the aquaculture, fish meal, and a lot of fish require fish meal, but fish meal is also, you know, a fit a purpose. You need to catch fish and get fish meal, grow fish. So a lot of the fish require very high protein. So microalgae, as you know, there's some of them have pretty high protein, like up to 80%, and most of them are 40%. So that'd be an excellent replacement of fish meal. But there's issues about, we have done studies, issues about this fish oil. So the fish meal, the protein might be replaced, but the fish oil, you know, is another necessary component. So it depends on how much omega-3 is the DHA, EPA in the microalgae. So that's another consideration.
Indeed. Zachary, Rebecca, and Ryan, you're all actively developing different kinds of products. What do you see as the best pathway, or is there some kind of a mix of products that will best balance the need for profitability and our desire to achieve some environmental benefit?
I can make a quick comment on that. So we started with biofuels over 10 years ago as well, funded by the Department of Energy and different grants. And that was when we realized that when you are growing the algae on high nutrient loads, you can get very fast growth rate, but you typically get lower lipids and lower oil content. So we see that a lot of protein was present in the biomass, and you're looking at animal feeds as one of the main sources, or fertilizers. But those proteins actually represent thermoplastic properties. The proteins are made of polymer chains of amino acids, and through heat and pressure and thermomechanical processing, you can reshape and reform these proteins into composites with either biodegradable or engineered and durable polymers. And so for us, our target customer in terms of the market is we've identified branded consumer products. Those are the companies that are producing materials that use plastics They have typically, especially the big ones, the publicly traded ones, have high-level corporate-led initiatives for ESG, environmental social governance. And so the teams there, the product developers, the sustainability teams, they're looking for solutions to integrate sustainable materials into their products and to improve their environmental metrics. And so we've identified that as a key growing market that is quite enormous in terms of demand. And so we're starting to reach this tipping point to where the consumer awareness is starting to create demand for products that have a more sustainable footprint. So we feel that the consumer products is a nice, good market and a good, strong pathway forward for at least the protein and the mineral fraction of the biomass that can't be used for aquafeed.
Thanks, Ryan. Rebecca, do you want to add something?
Sure. I would just say that sort of regardless of what you're growing, whether it's macroalgae or microalgae, you should take a dual approach, which is a market in approach and a technology out approach. So what does the market need that your biomass can serve, and how can you get there through your production process? And I think it's also important not to hole yourself into a single product. So for example, nanochlorosis, you can use that as a wholesale food or feed ingredient. That could be used as a soil amendment as well, or you could partition that biomass into oil, protein, and carbohydrates and do different things with all of those different partitions. The oils can be further broken down, so you could have a nutritional oil and then an oil that could be used to make polyols, for example. Dr. Mayfield has a publication on that. And so I think to try and use every piece of the biomass from the perspective of what are the components, what does the market need, how can my technology and my biomass fill that market need is the way to go.
Wise words, Zachary.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I just add that there's an incredible genetic diversity in algae, and that it's not, sure, a lot of them are little green balls, but hidden within that is an incredible biochemistry diversity, and that translates into different products. And so, I was making the joke that you don't wear soybeans and you don't eat cotton, but that's just a couple different plants, but algae are far more genetically diverse. And so there's a lot more product potential out there that can be realized. And I think we can leverage that as a community.
Thanks, everybody. Let's focus on the carbon drawdown, though, because arguably this is one of the more urgent problems that's facing us now, right? That we need to actively draw carbon out of the atmosphere. We can't just rely on emissions reductions anymore. We're past that point, unfortunately. So, what are your thoughts on how we can use microalgae and macroalgae to that end? Do we sink the biomass in the ocean? Do we put it in the consumer products? Which consumer products live the longest and therefore will sequester the carbon the longest? Give me your perspectives on that. Let me start with Simona.
Yeah, so obviously this is something that a lot of people are interested in for good reason, and there is, research going into sinking macroalgae to the depths of the ocean. I personally think that putting it into products seems beneficial because seaweeds are so versatile, and you can make plastics and food and feed, feed animals, and some of the work that we're doing at Oceanera is also looking at fermenting some of the products that we're producing to feed to herbivorous reef fish. So again, looking at how do we make a sustainable fish as well that could benefit from consuming macroalgae, because that's what they do in the wild. So why not just grow the fish in our aquaculture system and feed this to them? So I think that there's a lot of untapped resources, and I see people getting really creative, especially like around the East Coast where there's a lot of kelp growing, so there's a lot of ways that we can utilize this biomass for different things.
Yes, not to mention the unknown impacts of sinking gigatons of carbon into a hypoxic environment. Do others want to weigh in on this question?
I would just add that, you know, microalgae in particular is very CO2 intensive. You know, you have big CO2 cryogenic tanks on your farms, and you actively feed that to the algae. And the problem with this is that most of those farms are not co-located with anthropogenic sources. And so you're not maximizing the CO2 sink with that CO2 that you're feeding, because you have to truck it to the site, right? And there are emissions associated with just getting the CO2 to the site. And if we're really going to maximize the CO2 sink of microalgae, we're going to need more direct air capture, so that you have a unit on site. You can get rid of those transportation emissions and all the things that are associated with that, and really draw down, literally draw down and feed to the algae.
That's a great point, Rebecca. Are any of you guys aware of new ways to get the carbon in faster so that direct capture can be enhanced in microalgal pond culture, for example?
I think so. There is ongoing research in using direct air capture for driving kind of traditional microalgae cultivation, raceway style cultivation. There's some of the high alkaline ponds that are naturally allow CO2 to invade don't necessarily require external CO2 sources. So there are existing and I think developing and emerging technologies that can address that. I think the other thing to consider is that I think one role for both macro and microalgae is really as a displacement of other technologies that are even worse than what we're doing. And so I think, you know, we saw a couple of figures about how bad protein is from cattle. Yeah, it's horrible for CO2 emissions. And so, you know, if we can replace some fraction of that with protein derived from plant substances, that's going to help the bottom line. So thinking about that displacement is really important.
Thanks.
My quick comment is just, and you kind of alluded to it, Rod, is, you know, for the biofuel route, we're just taking that carbon and reintroducing it right back into the environment. So while there are applications and there's benefits from having a reduction of CO2 emissions, actually being able to capture irreversibly the carbon for at least some period of time, going after a consumer product or some sort of long-term durable material, whether it's construction material or some other product, does look like it's one of the easiest ways to lock up that carbon for years, maybe even decades. You know, and a lot of that goes back to being able to make the product, use the product, and then recycle the product. So the longer you can keep that circular cycle going, the better.
Indeed. We have a couple of minutes for questions. We got a couple of interesting ones from the audience. One of them has to do with non-native species in Alaska. So the questioner mentions that that's been an issue with seaweed mariculture off the coast of Alaska. Maybe Simona, have you encountered that issue in your operations, or how do you think that can be dealt with?
Well, I absolutely am a big you know, I advocate using native species. So I know it was my understanding that in Alaska, they were following the guidelines for salmon, which basically meant that you had to grow your seaweed, your kelp, you had to collect within 50 miles or kilometers within that area. So really trying to keep the genetics in that region. So I think, I'm not sure, the question is the introduction of non-native species in Alaska. You know, I would say stick with your native species, grow, you know, what's abundant in Alaska. And there's such a huge diversity of not only kelps, but green algae, red algae. I think there's still so much that we can explore. And Alaska is such a fantastic place to grow seaweed. And, you know, same for us at Oceanera, working with tropical seaweeds. You know, Hawaii has very strict rules about cultivating only native species. And that, you know, those are the principles that we're sticking with. So, but even within that, you know, even growing native species, you can still find strains that maybe perform better on your farm, or, you know, are maybe more tolerant of certain things. So I think there's still a lot of research that can be done in that area. So finding specific strains that would do better than others.
Thanks, Simona. And I don't know how much time we have left. I'm going to squeeze in one more and see if they cut us off. So there's a number of interesting questions about overall carbon balance. So if our goal here in part is to reduce overall atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, how can we be sure that we're achieving that if we're upwelling nutrients from deep layers? Because there's also carbon in that deep water that might outgas. Anybody have thoughts on that? Crickets. Well, you microalgae people are not going to encounter that because you're using industrial waste carbon and direct capture. Let's see.
I'd be happy to respond to that.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I'm Brian von Hersen from the Climate Foundation. The carbon to phosphorus of even the lowliest of kelps, Macrocystis, is approximately 220 to 1. And so if you want to track the carbon, measure the phosphorus. And with that premium over Redfield ratio of 2 to 1, presuming that all the phosphorus is in fact absorbed biogenically, the fraction that actually goes into the macroalgae then presents a super Redfield ratio between 220 to 1 and 800 to 1. So there's a strong premium associated with the fraction of phosphorus that can be fixed into kelps and tropical red seaweeds.
Thanks very much for that.
Pleasure.
Let's see, what else do we have here? Some comments about animal husbandry playing a larger role. Have you, any of our panelists, experienced any examples of, integrating animal cultivation with algal cultivation in ocean? Jen, you're working on one aspect of that problem, using microalgae as a feed ingredient to enhance the efficiency of finfish aquaculture, presumably. But what about the prospects for integrated multitrophic aquaculture?
I think an excellent example is that when you feed into seaweed to cows, you may reduce the methane production. So, that would be a great integration. Now, not at the larger scale yet, but, it's been pretty effective in the experimental condition. So that's one. And another sense, when we use microalgae to replace, or macroalgae replace soybean, and we could save the land and also the nitrogen, phosphorus, sort of withdraw from the arable land. Yeah, and then the other things I want to emphasize is here is when we should not only focus on the biomass, so we need to focus on the maybe CO2, uptake, as well as the bioavailable nutrients. So it's because there are quite there are a lot of species, of course. There also the process and the culture affected the outcome, the solubility and the bioavailability, and also the environmental impact as well. So need to be so our formula need to be fully balanced.
I would just add that I think it's important to consider the impacts on human health. So another use of microalgae in cattle and pig feeding, for example, is you can feed Nanochloropsis for the omega-3 content, and you produce meat from those animals and milk in the case of cows that has a much higher omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. And you can get it actually close to salmon if you feed the right ration. And then from there, you can take the nutrients from the manure and feed back to the algae. And so you're not only recapturing the nutrients that were used to grow the algae in the first place and using it to grow more algae, but you're growing healthier animals that in turn have the impact on human health because the meat products from them are better and more beneficial.
Excellent, Rebecca. Thank you for pointing that out. Actually, we're doing that. So we're trying to make the chicken like fish. And then also that we have a group look at the excreted and manure feeding the algae have been increased residual NH from the also have phosphorus recycle impact as well. So yes,
exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's a good place to land now that we're talking about a circular bioeconomy. So let me turn it over to Chuck.
Yeah, great.
Thank you, panelists.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank
Rod.
you, Rod.
Thank you, panel. That was really excellent. Yes, so we now have another panel, and I want to point out to them that we'll let them have equal time. We ran over a little bit there, but we'll just take that out of my time for concluding remarks. So let's move on to the next panel that Mark Edwards will be moderating.
Hello, Chuck and team. I think we'll do our panel a little differently. I'll ask each person to introduce themselves as they begin their talk. We're addressing one of several questions on the human value that we can create with the circular marine bioeconomy. And I have a couple of slides. If they're available, we'll use them. If not, I think they'll be available following the presentation. And the slides just refer to a book I've written on this whole process called Ecolanda. And Ecolanda does what Chuck Greene talked about. It's transformative in the sense that there are 4 projects in Oceania and Asia. Each one is 15 billion euros that integrates food, energy, waste, water, and an eco-city, all in a circular economy. And we introduced the concept of emerald system. So it'll be the first emerald circular economy. And you can email me and I'll send you a link that you can get the book free. And it in the Ecolanda Emerald Bioeconomy, we cover how algae, macro and micro, will be used to cycle the nutrients. And as Rebecca White just eloquently said, there's a whole chapter on human health, another chapter on animal health, another chapter on plant health, all benefiting from algae-based nutrients. So with that introduction, I'll just say all those things are available to you, and you can grab that. And with that, Deborah, could I ask you to start and talk about the circular marine bioeconomy?
Sure. Hi, my name is Deborah Sills. I'm an associate professor at Cornell University, and I started my work with algae actually as Chuck Greene's postdoc. So, and I've done quite a bit of work on life cycle assessment and techno-economic analysis of marine microalgae. And today, the focus of this panel is more social impacts. At least that's my understanding. Am I right, Mark? We're talking
Correct.
about yes.
Yes.
And so I haven't done scholarship on this topic, but I have started a social LCA study with a master's student applied to wastewater. And I guess I can say that this is something that has always been missing in my environmental life cycle assessment, techno-economic analysis. So with the social LCA work that we're in the midst of, we're using a database called the Social Hotspot Database, and looking at things like health and safety, which clearly algae would have a relation to, and community and governance, human rights and labor rights through the supply chain. So all I can say is I think we should apply this type of framework to algae as well. In addition, in my teaching, I've been reading this book called Design Justice by Sasha Costanza-Chock, and I will just say, as far as design justice principles, is that we really want to aim to sustain, heal, and empower communities, but also to seek liberation from exploitive and oppressive systems, something that I don't think we typically talk about in the algae community. And so how do we do that? Well, I've heard people talk about, well, this is going to be good for nutrition poor parts of the world, you know, algae. We can solve nutritional deficiencies, but we need to work with people and have them help design these systems and hear what they want and not just come in from above. So that's my intro. Thank
Great.
you for having me.
John Finley. Can you unmute yourself, please? Great. There we go.
Why don't we go on to, why don't we go to somebody else and then
yes, let's, Adrian, can you speak, please?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thanks for having me, and thanks for allowing me to bring a bit of a European flavor to this mix today. So my name is Adrian Vincent, and I'm the program director of Seaweed for Europe, which is a coalition we launched last year as a follow-up from the high-level panel for sustainable ocean economy I was working with. And this coalition is today bringing together around 80 players, a mix of seaweed SMEs, startups, investors, and NGOs to advance a sustainable seaweed industry in Europe. And I'm really happy to be on this panel to talk about the social dimension. We've talked a lot about health, but mostly over the past 4 hours, I've heard a lot about the environmental benefits of seaweed, but I think there is really a big social dimension in it as well. And when it comes to the territory I know more, which is Europe, one of my motivations to launch this coalition was also the job creation potential. And so we did a bit of an analysis last year and played with some scenarios to assess what could be the size and the benefits of the seaweed industry in Europe by 2030. And in our ambitious scenario, we calculated that that could be up to 115,000 jobs created in the seaweed industry. And what I think is highly relevant is that in our Western world, the coastal areas usually suffer from a lot of unemployment and hard transition from people, for instance, working in fisheries and facing depleted stocks. And I think seaweed could bring a new opportunity to revitalize these areas. So I think this is a big element also of the wonderful seaweed stories, that it's not only an environmental win, a health win, but it's also a social win.
Excellent. Jennifer?
There you go. Can you
Good.
hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm Jennifer Wickensteiner. I'm a postdoctoral researcher associate at the University of Western Brittany in France. And I work on fisheries and aquaculture management. And right now I'm looking at the different adaptation timing of fishing communities versus governance facing major changes. And I'm here as the ECOP representative, or the early career ocean professional from this morning session. So we did have some conversation around marine circular bioeconomy. So thank you for having me. And we did talk a bit about governance this morning and the issue of scale between what's going on from the harvesters of seaweed, what people on the community get, and the actual what's going on at the governance side. So we had a great conversation this morning, and would be happy to share more about that later on.
Jessica.
Hi, I'm Jessica Gephardt. I'm an assistant professor at American University in environmental science. Most of my work focuses on seafood trade and mostly finfish and crustaceans. So I haven't done as much trade work on the algae front. But I think one thing that's really critical here, and why I'm so happy that we're having this session, is that there has been a lot of positioning today about the role of algae in meeting these nutritional needs. And I think that it's really critical to step back and remember that right now, we already produce enough food to meet the global nutritional needs. The reason we're not is because of distributional issues. It's because of the social and the economic reasons. And so we really do need to think about those aspects if we're serious about addressing those issues and about these products playing a real role. The other thing is that when we talk about these benefits, it is, whether they be nutritional or economic, we really do need to think about benefits for whom, because that's going to vary throughout the world dramatically. And as we start to talk about bringing high value products in to these coastal spaces, you really do start to talk about these competing uses with traditional users, and to start to have to think about how access to these ocean resources are currently divided and who might be pushed out of that space Beyond that, with these high technology advances, a lot of them are really expensive. And so we need to think about technology transfer and knowledge transfer to ensure that the benefits of these advances are really equitably distributed. So looking forward to a discussion.
Great. Michelle?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me be part of this panel today. It's been quite a diverse 4 hours, and I've already learned a lot this morning. So my name is Michelle Tichelaar, and I'm in this blue space mostly through the food angle. I'm a research scientist at the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, and I help coordinate this international project that's called the Blue Food Assessment. And we're very lucky to have Jessica on that team as well. And as part of that, we're trying to assess the role that aquatic foods can play in bringing about a more nutritious, equitable, and sustainable food system in the future. And as part of that, I also got to lead work on the impacts or the risk that climate change poses to these nutritional and economic and social benefits of aquatic food systems. And admittedly, seaweeds and algae are really underrepresented in our work just because of data availability and the scale at which these are currently being produced. One theme that from today that I would like to pick up on a bit is something that Halley already brought up in her first talk today, which is on integrative decision-making and management. With the Blue Food Assessment, we're participating in conversations for the UN Food System Summit, which is going to take place in the fall. And already there, we're seeing that it's incredibly challenging to get people to talk about nutrition and sustainability and livelihoods in the same space. Decision-making around all these areas happens in really different areas. We have ministries of agriculture and fisheries. We have nutrition and health sit somewhere else entirely. And so now thinking today about all the dimensions that have been brought up in the discussions this morning, energy is now also a part of this mix of sets of decision makers and experts that need to be brought together to really be able to grow this sector in a way that meaningfully considers all the trade-offs and synergies that are possible there. So thanks for having me.
Excellent. John, are you available? Great.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, it can.
Okay. I'm John Finley. Thank you so much for allowing me to be on this panel. I am with the USDA Ag Research Service, where I run the research program in human nutrition. And in recent years, I've worked very closely with ARS as well as with our national society, the American Society of Nutrition, to really look at this intersection of food production, the environment, and health and nutrition. And it's really an integrated system that we have to look at. And I guess the big thing that I would lead off with is I've worked a lot with looking at food systems. That's the way we have to go. The reductionist approaches of the past don't work in this very complex system we're in. And a food system is a very complex, very unwieldy system. And if algae is, well, if any type of aquaculture, algae, etc., is going to be breaking into this, there's so many questions that have to be considered, and nutritional questions and what the product is, etc., all have to be looked at. Otherwise, it will remain a niche product.
Good points. Excellent points. Michelle, can you talk a little bit more about equity, social equity in the sense of nutrition? Because that is, I read a lot of the literature and I just don't see that in the literature.
Okay, so, all right, so that's a really broad question. And so I'm trying to figure out where to take that. When we think about aquatic food specifically, they are really rich sources of really essential micronutrients, and there are many people in the world that are currently lacking in micronutrients, and for whom in particular these micronutrients can bring disproportionately large benefits to their health. And this has particular implications for women and young children, where aquatic foods and the nutrients that they contain can really support women and children's health and cognitive development. So when we think about nutrition and social equity around now developing these new food systems, as Jessica pointed out, I think it's really important to consider by whom and for whom. How much is it going to cost to create these products, and who is going to be able to access and afford the products that come out of those? Currently, one of the largest barriers to healthy diets is the affordability of the diets. For aquatic foods in particular, we often see that really valuable nutrients are traded away from the locations where they are being produced. So when thinking about how can we develop circular bioeconomies that supply valuable nutrition, I think it's really important to think about who gets to be part of that process and who gets to access the products that come out of that.
Excellent. Jessica, would you like to comment on that, how we address the equity issues?
Sure. Well, I'd be happy to comment on that a bit and build off of what Michelle said, which was already a great introduction. I guess I would just, to add, the kind of distinguish between, there are the direct nutritional benefits that people can get from consuming these aquatic foods, but there's also the indirect benefits they can get from that income generation. And so when you have some of these high value products, when you are employing local communities and are raising standards of living, they may be able to afford other kinds of foods that may not be the really high value product that you're focused on. But if the economic benefits are actually distributed and you see that growth, you can still see these kinds of indirect benefits to nutrition. So we've seen that with aquaculture in some locations, Bangladesh, for example. But it's certainly not always the case that those economic benefits are captured locally. That is going to depend on the structures and incentives and the companies and how they're operating and what kinds of wages they're paying, of course. And so it really starts to get to the much broader question of how the economy is structured and how sort of progressive those policies are toward redistributing those benefits.
That's excellent, Jessica. One piece on Bangladesh, they have a heck of a problem with heavy metals, particularly arsenic. And there are a couple of studies now where they've given children who are arsenic poisoned, and the algae chelates with the arsenics and clears it out of the body. Pretty, that's a big deal because Bangladesh has more arsenic in the water than any place else in the world. And as we go deeper in deeper wells, the world will have a lot more heavy metals, especially arsenic. So those kinds of, I've written a book on that, algae as a food. Anna feeds our world, and I'll give it to any of you with just send me an email, I'll send you a link to it. So you're absolutely right. That'll be great. Jennifer, would you like to talk about equity or distribution of aquatic foods?
Sure. So something we discussed this morning with the other ECOPs is some stability in governance might not be always here, and it would impede equity between resource at the end. And so we were really trying to find some ways how knowledge could be shared and expanded from one country to another country, or from even communities to another community. So we had a lot of talk this morning about how could we help other country, region where, again, we don't have this top-down help. And so equity is definitely something we should consider more, but on research, yeah, I'm looking at the research side again.
And Adrian, regarding the seaweed process, both growing and harvesting and processing, does that have social equity in the sense of women and minorities able to do those jobs?
Well, Mark, I'm sorry, before I answer your question, I'd like just to add another point to this distribution of value discussion, which is also even in developed countries like the US and Europe, when we are trying to build and develop these seaweed industries, I think there is also a big question about the redistribution of value along the value chain. And we've talked about how we are 1,000 years behind the land-based food system and agriculture, and how we are only transitioning from hunter-gatherers to farmers in the ocean. But that's also an opportunity to avoid doing the same mistakes we have done on land with agriculture when it comes to the redistribution of value and the capture of value against the value chain. And when you look at land-based agriculture, I have this shocking fact in mind that in France, every 2 days, there is a farmer committing suicide. And this, I think, the job profession, at least in Europe, with the highest rate of suicide, because those guys just don't get the value from what they produce, and all the value is captured elsewhere when the food is being produced, packaged, and then sold. And so I think there is a big attention point when developing these new industries and the new value chains in our developed countries to make sure that we put in place governance and processes and systems to make sure that the value is redistributed along the value chain, including to the farmers, or we will just kill the industry even before it starts to grow. Then coming back to your question about minorities and indigenous groups, I have to be honest, I'm much more knowledgeable about the European case. So I'm happy to pass this question to someone who's maybe more familiar to developing countries and or areas where it would apply more naturally.
Well, thank you. And just FYI, the highest farmer suicide rate for the last 2 decades has been India. And I've written considerably on that, as has The Guardian. My blog, Algae 101, you can just to India farmer suicides, and I've got, I think, 3 or 4 posts on that unfortunate problem. I won't go into it at the moment, but that's industrial agriculture's ugly hit there. Deborah, can you address this issue of equity, please?
Yeah, so one thing I think about, so a lot of my work is actually on sanitation, and the Bill Gates Reinvent the Toilet project. Many have heard he put billions of dollars into reinventing the toilet. And but really communities on the ground, the building of the toilet is not really the problem. The problem is maintenance. The problem is women being afraid to go to the bathroom because they'll be raped. So there's all on the ground problems that all this money went to researchers at universities in the West. And so again, I would say, I think the same applies here. Once again, if we're looking at nutrition poor areas, I bet people there have ideas for solutions, and we should ask them and engage them to find solutions.
Excellent, yes. And I think we can learn a lot from the discussions yesterday and early this morning regarding the equity of sea level change and how those issues are being addressed, because it seems like with health and nutrition, we can use many of the same learnings that they're using in the sea level change technologies. And John Finley, can you talk on this topic of equity, please?
Well, I think the issue around equity from the standpoint of nutrition comes down to, can you improve the health of many of these locations that that need that, and let's use the example of algae alone, can that be used as a food source to improve the health? and this, it becomes very tricky because there are many things out there that can improve the health. And the reason, there are many foods out there that can improve health. And the reason that they aren't accessible or they aren't utilized is very complex. And so let's take, for example, what Deborah was just talking about. One of the projects that was done years ago, it was looking at putting vitamin A into the African sweet potato to combat vitamin A deficiency. Well, that was a great idea, except that it changed the sweet potato to an orange color, which was not culturally acceptable. It also meant you had to keep getting your sweet potato from the person that produced it. And as a result, studies showed that while farmers initially liked it, it died out. And the biofortification program has run into all of these obstacles. So I think you've got to take a look at, you know, what's been done in the past as you start looking at this. Is algae, for example, an acceptable ingredient to, let's say, Bangladesh? It does impart a different taste, you know, to the Asian countries. Maybe it's very different. It imparts a different taste. Then you have to look at the food safety concerns. Okay, you've chelated arsenic, but you've also may have toxified with iodine, for example. So there are many different levels you have to look at to be really sure that you've made an improvement rather than actually gone backwards. And I'm not saying this as a negative. I'm saying this as these are the things that have to be looked at.
Good point, John. Good point. Jennifer, you mentioned early childhood nutrition and how important it is that pregnant mothers get proper nutrition, because otherwise the offspring have developmental disabilities quite commonly. Can you comment on that a little bit more? Or did I get that right?
I think
Sorry, no,
about that.
I think it was Michelle. Yes.
Michelle, okay.
Well, I'll admit that nutrition is not my field, but there's been a lot of work done recently that in the last couple of years that has really shown the benefits of aquatic foods in particular to children in the first 1,000 days of life. And there's been some very exciting programs done in South and Southeast Asia, thinking about how aquatic foods can be better integrated into diets of small children. And so I believe it is in Myanmar that they did some projects with fish powder as part of feeding programs. Rolled Fish is a research center, part of the one CGIAR enterprise that has been doing a lot of research into this kind of work. And maybe that's an area where thinking about algae as a food additive and food supplement could be really promising. But again, not my core field.
I agree. That was a loaded question because I've got a whole chapter in Anna Feeds Our World on just exactly that point. And Antenna Research, Antenna is an NGO, has done marvelous research showing that a tablespoon of algae a day prevents it prevents all the micronutrient deficiencies that includes vitamin A, C, D, and B complex, the whole shebang. And the level of premature births in the US and globally is just terrible. And healthy mothers with full nutritional balance have much higher probability of full-term births and healthy children. So I think that's a big story that is going to help algae a lot, because that's a great source of the full spectrum of micronutrients.
I'd like to add something on that.
Sure,
I think you've got to be very careful, though. you can't equate what goes on in the global north to the problems in the global south, because the health disparities, the environmental conditions, genetics are all very, very different. And so if you take a group of people that are deficient in micronutrients and you supply them, yes, you get great benefits. On the other hand, if you take, Europe and the North America, where our malnutrition problem is obesity and a number of these things, we don't know what the benefit versus risk is. And so you can't extrapolate from one to the other. Certainly in terms of combating extreme deficiencies, it does have a place. Does it have a place in Western diets? That has to be looked at much more carefully.
Okay,
Good point. Good point.
I'm going to have to step in.
Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you, all panelists from both panels and both moderators. These were really interesting discussions. And it looks like we've actually hit the noon hour. So our 4 hours of intensive thinking about the marine circular bioeconomy is coming to a close. I want to thank you all for participating and attending. It's really been quite a eventful and informative session, and I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. So thank you for joining us.